Friedrich Nietzsche stands as one of history's most controversial and misunderstood philosophers. Born in 1844 in Germany, he challenged every foundation of Western thought and morality. His ideas were so radical that they shook the very core of human belief systems. Today we explore the 20 most provocative concepts that made him both famous and feared across the world. Part 1. God is dead. Nietzsche's most famous declaration shocked the religious world of his time and continues to disturb people today. When he wrote that God is dead, he was not celebrating or mourning this fact. Instead, he was making a bold observation about what was happening to Western civilization. He believed that science and reason had slowly killed the need for religious belief in educated society. This statement first appeared in his book The Gay Science, written in 1882. Nietzsche put these words in the mouth of a madman who runs through the marketplace crying out this terrible news. The madman asks where God has gone and then answers his own question. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But what did Nietzsche really mean by this dramatic announcement? He was not making a literal claim about the existence or non-existence of a divine being. Instead, he was pointing out that God no longer functioned as the foundation of meaning and morality in European culture. For over 1,000 years, Christianity had provided the framework for understanding right and wrong, purpose and meaning. The rise of scientific thinking had slowly undermined this religious foundation. Darwin's theory of evolution challenged the biblical account of creation. Advances in physics and astronomy showed that the universe operated according to natural laws rather than divine intervention. Historical criticism revealed that religious texts had been written and edited by human beings over many centuries. Educated Europeans were beginning to see religion as outdated superstition. They still went through the motions of religious observance, but their hearts and minds were no longer truly committed. God had become irrelevant to their daily lives and decision-making. This is what Nietzsche meant when he said, God is dead. The death of God created what Nietzsche saw as the greatest crisis in human history. For thousands of years, people had found meaning, purpose, and moral guidance through religious faith. Religious belief answered the big questions about why we exist and how we should live. It provided comfort in times of suffering and hope for life after death. Now that foundation was crumbling, leaving humanity without a compass. If there is no God, then there is no ultimate purpose to existence. If there is no divine lawgiver, then moral rules become merely human opinions. If there is no afterlife, then this life becomes the only chance we have for meaning and happiness. Nietzsche worried that most people were not ready to face these implications. Without God, they would fall into despair and meaninglessness. They might embrace nihilism, the belief that nothing matters and life has no value. Or they might cling desperately to dead religious forms that no longer provided real guidance. He predicted that the 20th century would be an age of wars and catastrophes as humanity struggled with this loss of meaning. Looking back at the world wars, genocides, and ideological conflicts that followed, many scholars believe Nietzsche was remarkably prophetic. The collapse of traditional religious authority did indeed lead to tremendous upheaval and violence. People filled the void left by God with new ideologies like nationalism, communism, and fascism. But Nietzsche also saw the death of God as the greatest opportunity in human history. For the first time, humans could take full responsibility for creating their own values and meaning. No longer would they need to follow rules handed down from above by religious authorities. They could become the creators of their own destiny and the architects of their own moral systems. This freedom was both terrifying and exhilarating. It required tremendous courage and creativity to build meaning from scratch. Most people would not be up to this challenge, but a few exceptional individuals could rise to become what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, or overman. These individuals would create new values that could guide humanity into the future. The death of God also meant the end of absolute moral standards. Good and evil would no longer be determined by divine command, but by human choice and creativity. This did not mean that anything goes or that all choices are equally valid. Instead, it meant that humans would need to take responsibility for evaluating the consequences of their actions and creating ethical systems based on reason and experience. Part 2. The Will to Power. Nietzsche believed that beneath all human behavior lies a single driving force called the will to power. This concept represents his most fundamental insight into human nature and the nature of life itself. The will to power is not simply the desire to control others, though that can be one expression of it. Instead, it is the basic urge to grow, expand, overcome obstacles, and become more than what you currently are. This drive manifests itself in countless ways throughout human experience. It pushes artists to create masterpieces that will outlast their own lives. It drives scientists to make discoveries that expand human knowledge and capability. It motivates athletes to push their bodies beyond previously known limits. It inspires entrepreneurs to build companies and inventors to create new technologies. Even acts of kindness and charity can be expressions of the will to power when they come from a desire to become a better person. Nietzsche saw the will to power operating not just in humans, but in all living things. Plants grow toward the sun and compete for resources. Animals fight for territory and mates. Even the simplest organisms struggle to survive and reproduce. This universal drive toward growth and expansion is what Nietzsche believed lay at the heart of existence itself. Life is not about maintaining balance or finding peace, but about constantly striving to become more powerful. Traditional morality, especially Christianity, had tried to suppress this natural drive. Religious teachings emphasized humility, meekness, and acceptance of one's place in life. People were told to turn the other cheek when attacked, and to love their enemies. They were encouraged to deny their worldly desires and focus on spiritual salvation in the afterlife. Nietzsche saw these teachings as deeply harmful to human potential and psychological health. By fighting against our basic nature, traditional morality created internal conflict and resentment. The suppression of the will to power led to what Nietzsche called slave morality. People who could not express their power directly began to value weakness, suffering, and self-denial. They made virtues out of their limitations and turned their resentment into a moral system. Instead of striving to become stronger, they convinced themselves that strength was evil and weakness was good. This created a culture of mediocrity and spiritual sickness that Nietzsche believed was poisoning European civilization. People were becoming smaller, weaker, and less capable with each generation. Nietzsche argued that we should stop fighting our basic nature and instead learn to channel the will to power in healthy directions. This does not mean becoming cruel, dominating, or trampling over others. True power comes from mastering yourself and developing your capabilities to their fullest extent. It means having the courage to pursue your deepest goals and the discipline to overcome the obstacles in your path. It means creating something of value rather than simply consuming what others have made. It means taking responsibility for your life rather than blaming others for your failures. The will to power also involves the ability to impose your interpretation on events and circumstances. Powerful individuals do not simply react to what happens to them. Instead, they actively shape the meaning of their experiences. They turn setbacks into learning opportunities and obstacles into challenges to overcome. They create their own values and live according to their own standards rather than following the crowd. This requires tremendous mental strength and emotional resilience. Nietzsche distinguished between different types of power and argued that some expressions are higher than others. The lowest form is crude physical domination based on force and fear. Higher forms involve intellectual, artistic, or spiritual influence that inspires others to become better versions of themselves. The highest expression of the will to power is self-creation and self-overcoming. This means constantly working to improve yourself and expand your capabilities. It means having the courage to question your own beliefs and change your mind when you discover better ideas. The concept of will to power has been widely misunderstood and misused throughout history. Some people have used it to justify violence, oppression, and cruelty. But this completely misses Nietzsche's point. True power is creative rather than destructive. It builds up rather than tears down. It creates beauty, knowledge, and value rather than spreading ugliness and ignorance. The person who truly understands the will to power becomes a source of inspiration and strength for others rather than a cause of fear and suffering. Part 3. The Übermensch. The concept of the Übermensch, or overman, represents Nietzsche's vision of what humanity could become after the death of God. This idea has been more misinterpreted and abused than perhaps any other philosophical concept in history. The Nazis attempted to use it to justify their racist ideology, but they completely perverted Nietzsche's original meaning. The Übermensch is not about racial superiority or political domination. Instead, it represents the possibility of individual human beings transcending their current limitations and creating new values for themselves and others. It is about spiritual and intellectual evolution rather than physical or genetic characteristics. Nietzsche first introduced this concept in his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, written between 1883 and 1885. The character of Zarathustra comes down from his mountain retreat to announce that man is something that must be overcome. Humans, as they currently exist, are not the final goal of evolution, but rather a bridge between animals and something higher. The Übermensch represents what we might become if we have the courage to grow beyond our present state. The path to becoming an Übermensch begins with recognizing that traditional sources of meaning and morality have lost their power. Once someone truly understands that God is dead and that conventional values are human creations rather than eternal truths, they face a crucial choice. They can either fall into despair and nihilism or take on the tremendous responsibility of creating their own meaning and values. Most people will choose the easier path of following existing customs and beliefs even after they no longer truly believe in them. But a few exceptional individuals will have the courage to become value creators rather than value followers. These are the potential Übermenschen of the future. The Übermensch does not reject all existing values and start from nothing. Instead, they carefully examine inherited beliefs and customs to determine which ones serve life and growth and which ones hinder human flourishing. They keep what is valuable and discard what is harmful or outdated. Then they create new values to fill the gaps and guide themselves and others toward greater health, strength, and creativity. This process requires tremendous intellectual honesty and emotional courage. It means being willing to stand alone when necessary and to face criticism from those who cling to traditional ways of thinking. One of the key characteristics of the Übermensch is the ability to affirm life completely. This means saying yes to existence with all its suffering, uncertainty and tragedy. Most people try to escape from the painful aspects of life through religion, drugs, entertainment or other forms of distraction. The Übermensch embraces both joy and sorrow as necessary parts of the human experience. They understand that growth requires struggle and that meaning emerges from overcoming obstacles rather than avoiding them. This does not mean seeking out unnecessary suffering, but rather accepting that difficulty and pain are inevitable parts of any worthwhile life. The Übermensch also possesses what Nietzsche called intellectual honesty. They are willing to face uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world rather than hiding behind comfortable illusions. They question their own beliefs and motivations as rigorously as they question those of others. They admit their mistakes and learn from their failures instead of making excuses or blaming external circumstances. This kind of honesty requires tremendous psychological strength because it means giving up the ego protection that most people rely on to feel good about themselves. But it also leads to genuine self-knowledge and the ability to make real improvements rather than just imaginary ones. Another essential quality is creative power. The Übermensch is not content to simply consume what others have created or to follow paths that others have laid out. They have the urge and ability to bring something new into the world. This might be a work of art, a scientific discovery, a new way of thinking about ethics, or simply a unique approach to living. The key is that they add value to existence rather than just taking from it. They leave the world richer than they found it through their presence and efforts. The Übermensch also demonstrates what Nietzsche called Amor Fati, or love of fate. They not only accept what has happened in their lives, but actively embrace it as necessary for making them who they are. They would not change their past even if they could, because they understand that their struggles and failures were essential for their growth and development. This is very different from passive resignation or bitter acceptance. It is an active, joyful embrace of their entire life story, including the parts that were painful or difficult. This attitude frees them from resentment and regret so they can focus their energy on creating their future rather than dwelling on their past. Nietzsche believed that the Übermensch would be rare, and that most people would never achieve this level of self-development. But he also thought that even the possibility of such individuals emerging would benefit all of humanity. They would serve as examples of what is possible and as creators of new values that could guide civilization toward health and growth. They would be like artists who expand our understanding of beauty, or scientists who reveal new truths about nature. Their very existence would raise the standard for what it means to be human and inspire others to reach higher than they previously thought possible. Part 4. Master and Slave Morality. One of Nietzsche's most penetrating insights concerned the existence of two fundamentally different types of moral systems throughout human history. He called these master morality and slave morality, and he argued that understanding the difference between them was crucial for grasping how values develop and spread through society. This distinction helps explain why different cultures have such different ideas about what is good and evil, and why moral conflicts seem so difficult to resolve. It also reveals how resentment and weakness can disguise themselves as virtue and righteousness. Master morality emerged among the ruling classes of ancient societies. These were the warriors, nobles, and leaders who had the power to shape their own destinies and the destinies of others. Their values reflected their position of strength and independence. They valued courage, honor, nobility, strength, beauty, and excellence. What they considered good was whatever enhanced life, power, and human flourishing. What they considered bad was whatever diminished these qualities. They saw themselves as the creators and definers of value rather than followers of external moral authorities. Their morality was active, creative, and life-affirming. Masters judged actions and people based on consequences and results rather than intentions or feelings. A brave warrior who died fighting for his people was good regardless of whether he felt fear or doubt. A leader who made difficult decisions that benefited his society was praiseworthy even if those decisions caused some people pain. They understood that life involves conflict and that someone has to make hard choices. They took responsibility for wielding power and did not apologize for their strength or success. They believed that the strong had a right and duty to rule over the weak for the benefit of everyone. Slave morality developed among the oppressed and powerless members of society. These were people who lacked the ability to control their circumstances or shape their environment according to their will. Unable to express power directly, they created a moral system that made virtues out of their limitations. They valued humility, meekness, compassion, equality, and self-sacrifice. What they considered good was whatever helped the weak and suffering. What they considered evil was whatever demonstrated strength, pride, or self-assertion. Their morality was reactive, defensive, and born from resentment against those who possessed what they lacked. They convinced themselves that their weakness was actually moral superiority. Slaves judged actions and people based on intentions and feelings rather than results. Someone who meant well was good, even if their actions caused harm. Someone who achieved great things was suspicious if they seemed to enjoy their success or take pride in their accomplishments. They preferred noble failures to successful achievements and celebrated suffering more than joy. They believed that the meek would inherit the earth and that the last would be first. This gave them hope and comfort, but also prevented them from developing the strength they would need to actually improve their situation. Christianity represented the ultimate triumph of slave morality in Western civilization. Jesus himself embodied many slave moral values by choosing poverty over wealth, weakness over power, and suffering over pleasure. He blessed the meek, the poor in spirit, and those who mourned. He taught his followers to turn the other cheek, love their enemies, and give away their possessions. The early Christians were indeed mostly slaves and outcasts from Roman society, who found comfort in a religion that promised them eternal reward for their earthly suffering. They transformed their resentment against their Roman masters into a moral system that made weakness holy and strength sinful. Over many centuries, Christian slave morality gradually conquered the master morality of the classical world. The values of strength, beauty, and excellence that had characterized Greek and Roman culture were replaced by values of humility, self-denial, and otherworldliness. Warriors became monks, and rulers became servants of the church. Physical beauty and intellectual achievement became suspect because they might lead to pride. The goal of life shifted from earthly flourishing to heavenly salvation. This great transformation had profound effects on art, politics, philosophy, and every other aspect of European culture. Nietzsche argued that slave morality had made Europeans weak, sick, and unable to affirm life. Instead of celebrating human excellence and achievement, they had learned to feel guilty about their successes and to pity their failures. Instead of striving to become stronger and more capable, they had learned to value weakness and limitation. Instead of creating beauty and meaning in this world, they had learned to focus on an imaginary afterlife. This had produced a culture of mediocrity and resentment that was slowly destroying the vitality of Western civilization. People were becoming smaller, more fearful, and less capable with each generation. But Nietzsche did not simply want to return to ancient master morality. He recognized that slave morality had also contributed valuable insights about compassion, justice, and care for the suffering. The problem was that these insights had been twisted by resentment and used to attack life and strength rather than enhance them. What was needed was a new synthesis that could preserve the best of both moral traditions while discarding their harmful elements. This new morality would value both strength and compassion, both excellence and care for others. It would be life-affirming rather than life-denying, and would help humans become more than they currently are, rather than making them comfortable with their limitations. The key was to recognize that both master and slave morality are human creations rather than eternal truths. Once we understand how these moral systems developed and what psychological needs they serve, we can begin to create better values that serve life and growth. We can keep what is valuable from each tradition and discard what is harmful or outdated. This requires the kind of critical thinking and creative courage that Nietzsche associated with the Übermensch. Only by going beyond both master and slave morality can humans create a truly life-affirming ethics for the future. This would be neither the morality of the strong dominating the weak, nor the morality of the weak resenting the strong, but something entirely new that serves the flourishing of all life. Part 5. Eternal Recurrence. Among all of Nietzsche's concepts, eternal recurrence stands as perhaps the most mysterious and challenging to understand. This idea suggests that time is cyclical rather than linear, and that everything that has ever happened will happen again exactly the same way an infinite number of times. Every moment of your life, every thought you have thought, every word you have spoken, and every choice you have made will be repeated endlessly throughout eternity. The pain and joy, the successes and failures, the love and loss will all occur again and again without any variation or possibility of change. Nietzsche first introduced this concept in The Gay Science and later developed it further in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He presented it not as a scientific theory about the nature of time, but as what he called the greatest weight or the heaviest burden that a person could bear. The question he posed was simple but profound. If you discovered that your life would be repeated exactly as you have lived it an infinite number of times, would you be filled with despair, or would you be able to affirm this reality with joy? This test reveals something fundamental about how you evaluate your own existence and choices. It forces you to confront whether you truly love your life or whether you are merely enduring it while hoping for something better. For most people, the idea of eternal recurrence would be a source of horror. They would be devastated to think that their mistakes, their suffering, and their failures would have to be experienced over and over again for all eternity. They might feel trapped in a cosmic prison with no possibility of escape or improvement. This reaction reveals that they fundamentally reject their own lives and wish they could live differently. They are carrying regret, resentment and disappointment that prevents them from fully embracing their existence. They are waiting for their real life to begin, or hoping that death will provide relief from their current circumstances. But Nietzsche believed that some exceptional individuals would be able to embrace eternal recurrence with complete joy. These would be people who have achieved what he called Amor Fati, or love of fate. They would not only accept every aspect of their lives, but actively desire to live them again exactly as they have been lived. They would feel such gratitude for their existence that the thought of infinite repetition would seem like the greatest gift imaginable. This reaction reveals a fundamental affirmation of life that goes beyond temporary pleasures or satisfactions. It indicates a deep understanding that even suffering and failure are necessary parts of what makes life meaningful and beautiful. The concept of eternal recurrence serves as a powerful psychological test for evaluating your relationship with your own life. If the thought fills you with dread, it suggests that you need to make some changes in how you live or how you think about your existence. Perhaps you are living according to other people's expectations rather than your own values. Perhaps you are avoiding difficult challenges that would help you grow. Perhaps you are holding on to resentments about past hurts that prevent you from moving forward. Perhaps you are postponing your happiness until some future condition is met. The doctrine of eternal recurrence forces you to confront these evasions and excuses. It demands that you take full responsibility for your life as it actually is, rather than as you wish it could be. Nietzsche saw eternal recurrence as closely connected to his critique of traditional religion. Most religious systems teach people to endure suffering in this life by promising rewards in an afterlife. They encourage believers to see earthly existence as a temporary trial or test that must be passed in order to reach eternal bliss. This attitude prevents people from fully embracing and enjoying their actual lives. It creates a split between the sacred and the secular, the spiritual and the physical, the eternal and the temporal. Eternal recurrence abolishes this split by making every moment equally eternal and equally important. There is no other world to escape to, and no future reward to work toward. This life, exactly as you are living it now, is all there is and all there ever will be. This realization can be either crushing or liberating depending on your perspective. If you have been living a diminished life while waiting for something better, the news that nothing better is coming can destroy your hope and motivation. But if you can learn to find meaning and value in your present circumstances, eternal recurrence becomes a celebration rather than a curse. Every moment becomes precious because it will be experienced forever. Every choice becomes monumentally important because its consequences will be repeated throughout eternity. Every relationship becomes sacred because it will never truly end. This perspective can transform ordinary life into something extraordinary and holy. It makes every day an opportunity to create something worthy of eternal repetition. The doctrine also has important implications for how we think about moral responsibility. If every action will be repeated exactly the same way infinite times, then we bear absolute responsibility for everything we do. There are no second chances, no opportunities for redemption, and no possibility of escaping the consequences of our choices. This makes ethical decision-making extremely serious and personal. We cannot rely on forgiveness from God or hope that time will heal all wounds. We must live in such a way that we can honestly say we want every detail of our lives to be repeated forever. This standard is much higher than conventional morality. which often focuses on avoiding the worst outcomes rather than creating the best ones. Eternal Recurrence demands excellence rather than mere adequacy. Whether or not eternal recurrence is literally true, Nietzsche believed that thinking about it could transform how people live. It forces us to ask fundamental questions about what makes life worth living and what kinds of choices create meaning and value. It challenges us to become the kinds of people who can honestly say that they love their fate completely. It pushes us toward greater self-awareness, authenticity, and courage in pursuing our deepest goals and values. Most importantly, it helps us move beyond resentment and regret toward a full affirmation of existence in all its complexity and difficulty. For Nietzsche, this affirmation was the highest achievement possible for human beings. Part 6. Beyond Good and Evil. The title of one of Nietzsche's most important books, Beyond Good and Evil, captures his radical challenge to traditional moral thinking. Most people assume that good and evil are absolute categories that apply to all situations and all people throughout history. They believe that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of context, consequences, or cultural differences. Nietzsche argued that this black-and-white approach to morality was not only false, but actively harmful to human development and flourishing. He believed that the time had come for humanity to move beyond these simplistic categories toward a more sophisticated understanding of value and meaning. This did not mean abandoning all standards or embracing moral relativism, but rather developing the intellectual courage to create new and better ways of evaluating human action. Traditional morality, especially as embodied in Christianity, had divided all human experiences into two opposing camps. Actions, thoughts, and desires were classified as either good or evil, with no middle ground allowed. This dualistic thinking created artificial conflicts between body and soul, reason and faith, this world and the next world. It forced people to deny or suppress aspects of their nature that did not fit into the approved categories. Nietzsche saw this as psychologically damaging and philosophically naive. Real life is much more complex and ambiguous than traditional morality acknowledged. The same action might be beneficial in one situation and harmful in another. The same person might embody both admirable and deplorable qualities. The same society might produce both beautiful art and terrible cruelty. A mature understanding of ethics must be able to handle this complexity rather than trying to force everything into oversimplified categories. Going beyond good and evil does not mean that nothing matters or that all choices are equally valid. Nietzsche was not advocating for moral nihilism or complete relativism. Instead, he wanted to replace absolute moral categories with more nuanced and contextual ways of evaluating human behavior. Rather than asking whether something is good or evil, we should ask whether it enhances or diminishes life. Rather than following universal rules, we should consider the specific circumstances and the particular individuals involved. Rather than judging based on abstract principles, we should look at actual consequences and real effects on human flourishing. This approach requires much more intellectual sophistication and moral courage than simply following predetermined commandments. It demands that each person take responsibility for thinking through ethical questions rather than relying on external authorities. One of the key insights behind going beyond good and evil is the recognition that moral systems are human creations rather than eternal truths. Different cultures have developed radically different ideas about right and wrong based on their particular circumstances, needs, and values. What one society considers virtuous, another might consider vicious. What one era celebrates as noble, another might condemn as barbaric. This does not mean that all moral systems are equally good, but it does mean that none of them can claim absolute and universal validity. They are all attempts by human beings to solve the problem of how to live together and how to create meaning and value in their lives. Some attempts are more successful than others, but all of them are provisional and subject to revision as circumstances change. Understanding this gives us the freedom to evaluate inherited moral beliefs critically and to modify or replace them when they no longer serve their intended purposes. Nietzsche believed that the great moral systems of the past had served their historical purpose, but were no longer adequate for modern life. Christian morality had helped to civilize barbaric peoples and create social order during the chaotic centuries following the fall of Rome. But by the 19th century, it had become a hindrance to further human development. Its emphasis on humility, self-denial, and otherworldliness was making Europeans weak, passive, and unable to cope with the challenges of modern existence. Its absolute prohibitions and rigid categories were preventing people from thinking creatively about new moral problems. Its reliance on divine authority was becoming incredible to educated people who no longer believed in literal interpretations of religious doctrine. The time had come to develop new approaches to ethics that could guide humanity into an uncertain future. This would require what Nietzsche called a revaluation of all values. Going beyond good and evil also involves recognizing the complex motivations behind human behavior. Traditional morality often assumes that people act from simple and pure motives like love, duty, or greed. Nietzsche argued that real human psychology is much more complicated than this. The same action might spring from multiple and conflicting desires. Someone might perform a charitable act partly from genuine compassion and partly from a desire to feel superior to those they are helping. Someone might follow moral rules partly from conviction and partly from fear of social disapproval. Someone might pursue knowledge partly from curiosity and partly from a desire for power over others. Understanding these mixed motives does not necessarily make the actions less valuable, but it does make moral judgment more difficult and ambiguous. It requires us to give up the comfortable illusion that we can easily distinguish heroes from villains and good people from bad people. Instead, we must learn to appreciate the complexity and contradictions that exist within every human being. The movement beyond good and evil is closely connected to Nietzsche's concept of intellectual honesty. Most people prefer moral systems that make them feel good about themselves and their choices. They want to believe that they are fundamentally good people who deserve reward and recognition. They want to believe that their enemies are fundamentally evil people who deserve punishment and condemnation. This kind of thinking provides psychological comfort but prevents genuine understanding and growth. Going beyond good and evil requires the courage to see ourselves and others as we actually are, rather than as we would like to be. It means acknowledging our own capacity for both creation and destruction, both love and hatred, both nobility and pettiness. It means giving up the security of absolute moral certainty in exchange for the freedom to think and choose more authentically. This transition is not easy, and not everyone will be capable of making it successfully. Nietzsche believed that most people need the guidance and comfort provided by traditional moral systems. They lack the intellectual strength and emotional maturity to handle moral ambiguity and uncertainty. But he also believed that some exceptional individuals would be able to create new values that could eventually guide all of humanity toward greater health and flourishing. These philosophers of the future would combine the best insights from different moral traditions while discarding what had become harmful or obsolete. They would be artists of morality who could paint in shades of grey rather than just black and white. Their work would be essential for helping civilization navigate the challenges that lay ahead in a world where traditional sources of meaning and authority had lost their power. Going beyond good and evil is therefore not just an intellectual exercise, but a practical necessity for anyone who wants to live authentically in the modern world. Part 7. The Last Man. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduced one of his most chilling visions of humanity's potential future. He called this figure the last man, representing what human beings might become if they chose comfort and security over growth and excellence. The last man embodies everything that Nietzsche feared about the direction of modern civilization. He is the opposite of the Übermensch, representing not human potential fulfilled, but human potential abandoned. Understanding this concept helps us see why Nietzsche was so concerned about the cultural trends of his time and why he believed that humanity stood at a crucial crossroads. The choice between becoming last men or Übermenschen would determine whether the human species continued to evolve or began to degenerate into something smaller and weaker than what it had already achieved. The last man is characterized above all by his desire for comfort and his aversion to anything that might disturb his peace. He has eliminated struggle, danger, and uncertainty from his life as much as possible. He wants security, predictability, and ease above all other values. He has organized society to provide maximum safety and minimum risk. Everyone has enough food, shelter, and entertainment to keep them satisfied, but not enough challenge or responsibility to promote growth. Conflict has been minimized through tolerance and compromise. Standards have been lowered to ensure that everyone can succeed without much effort. Pain and suffering have been medicated away whenever possible. The result is a society of people who are physically comfortable but spiritually empty. They have gained the whole world of material pleasures, but lost their souls in the process. The last man is also characterized by his lack of passion and commitment. He does not love or hate anything deeply enough to fight for it or sacrifice for it. He has opinions, but holds them lightly and changes them when it becomes socially convenient. He pursues pleasures, but in a half-hearted way that brings temporary satisfaction without lasting fulfillment. He forms relationships, but keeps them shallow to avoid the complications that come with genuine intimacy. He has goals, but abandons them quickly when they prove difficult to achieve. Everything in his life is lukewarm and mediocre. He has lost the capacity for the kind of intense experiences that make life meaningful and memorable. He exists rather than truly living, surviving rather than thriving. He has confused being comfortable with being happy and being safe with being alive. Another defining characteristic of the last man is his herd mentality. He desperately wants to fit in with others and avoid standing out in any way that might attract criticism or attention. He follows fashion and popular opinion, not because he has thought about these things carefully, but because conformity feels safer than independence. He is suspicious of anyone who has strong convictions or unusual ideas. He prefers leaders who promise to maintain the status quo, rather than those who call for significant changes or improvements. He values equality not because he believes in justice, but because he fears that someone else might have more than he does. He has given up his individual judgment and personal responsibility in exchange for the security of being part of the crowd. He has become what Nietzsche called a herd animal rather than a genuine human being. The Last Man also exhibits what Nietzsche saw as a particularly modern form of nihilism. He does not believe that life has any ultimate meaning or purpose, but instead of finding this liberating, he finds it depressing. Since nothing really matters, he concludes that he might as well pursue whatever gives him immediate pleasure or relief from boredom. He becomes a consumer of experiences rather than a creator of values. He fills his time with entertainment, shopping, travel, and other distractions that prevent him from confronting the emptiness at the center of his existence. He treats his own life as something to be managed rather than something to be lived. He has lost touch with the sources of meaning that previous generations found in religion, honor, love, or service to great causes. But he has not replaced these with anything equally powerful or inspiring. He exists in a state of comfortable despair that he mistakes for contentment. He has settled for being a successful animal instead of striving to become a genuine human being. Nietzsche believed that the Last Man represented the natural endpoint of democratic and egalitarian movements. These political philosophies aimed to reduce suffering and increase equality, which were admirable goals in themselves. But when pursued without wisdom or restraint, they could create a society that eliminated not just unnecessary pain, but also necessary challenges. They could produce not just equal opportunity, but equal outcomes, not just political freedom, but freedom from responsibility. They could create a world where everyone was taken care of, but no one was called to excellence. The Last Man was Nietzsche's warning about what might happen if humanity chose the path of least resistance and organized society around avoiding suffering rather than promoting flourishing. The emergence of the Last Man would represent a kind of evolutionary dead end for the human species. Unlike animals, humans have the capacity for self-improvement and self-transcendence. They can consciously choose to become more than they currently are. They can create art, pursue knowledge, build civilizations, and explore the furthest reaches of possibility. But the Last Man has abandoned this capacity in favor of simple comfort and security. He has chosen to remain static rather than continue growing. He represents not just personal failure, but species failure. He is the human being who has given up on becoming more human. But Nietzsche did not present the Last Man as inevitable or unavoidable. He was a warning about one possible future, not a prediction about the only possible future. The choice between becoming last men or Übermenschen was still open and would be determined by the decisions that individuals and societies made in the coming generations. Those who had the courage to embrace difficulty, uncertainty and responsibility could still become creators of new values and meaning. Those who chose the easier path of comfort and conformity would gradually lose their humanity and become last men. Nietzsche hoped that by clearly describing both possibilities, he could inspire people to choose the more difficult but more rewarding path toward greatness. The Last Man serves as a mirror in which we can examine our own lives and ask whether we are moving toward excellence or mediocrity. The answer to that question will determine not just our individual destinies, but the future of human civilization itself. Part 8. The Revaluation of All Values. Nietzsche believed that his generation stood at the most important turning point in human history. The old sources of meaning and morality were dying or dead, but new ones had not yet emerged to replace them. This created both a tremendous crisis and a tremendous opportunity. If humanity could successfully navigate this transition, it might emerge stronger and more creative than ever before. But if it failed to create new values to replace the old ones, civilization might collapse into nihilism and decay. Nietzsche saw himself as a philosopher whose task was to help guide this transition by calling for what he termed a revaluation of all values. This would be the most radical and comprehensive examination of human beliefs and practices ever undertaken. Everything that people had taken for granted about right and wrong, good and evil, sacred and profane, would need to be questioned and evaluated anew. The revaluation of all values was necessary because the foundations of Western civilization had been undermined by intellectual and social developments. Scientific discoveries had made religious cosmology impossible to believe literally. Historical criticism had revealed that sacred texts were human documents rather than divine revelations. Democratic movements had challenged the authority of traditional rulers and hierarchies. Economic changes had disrupted established social patterns and relationships. All of these developments were positive in themselves, but they had the unintended consequence of destroying the coherent worldview that had given meaning and direction to European culture for over 1,000 years. People were left without clear guidance about how to live or what to value. Some retreated into fundamentalism and tried to restore the old beliefs by force. Others embraced nihilism and concluded that nothing really mattered. But Nietzsche believed that the best response was to consciously and deliberately create new values that could serve as foundations for a healthy civilization. This revaluation would need to begin with an honest examination of how existing values had developed and what purposes they served. Most people assumed that their moral beliefs were eternal truths that had always existed and would always be valid. But Nietzsche argued that all values were human creations that emerged from particular historical circumstances and psychological needs. Christian morality, for example, had developed among oppressed people who needed hope and comfort in the face of suffering and powerlessness. It served their needs well for many centuries, but it was not necessarily appropriate for people living in different circumstances. Democratic values had emerged from the struggle against tyranny and oppression, but they might not be suitable for societies that had already achieved basic freedom and equality. Understanding the historical origins of values would help people evaluate which ones were still useful and which ones had become outdated or harmful. It would also help them understand that creating new values was both possible and necessary. The revaluation would also need to examine the psychological effects of different value systems. Nietzsche believed that some values promoted human health, growth and flourishing, while others promoted sickness, stagnation and decay. Values that encourage people to develop their capabilities, face challenges courageously, and create beauty and meaning were life-affirming. Values that encourage people to remain weak, avoid difficulties, and focus on imaginary rewards in an afterlife were life-denying. The test of any moral system should be whether it helps people become stronger, more creative, and more capable of joy. If a value system made people weaker, more resentful, and less able to affirm their existence, then it should be abandoned regardless of how old or venerable it might be. This psychological approach to evaluation was very different from traditional methods that focused on divine commands or abstract principles. It put human welfare and development at the center of moral thinking, rather than treating them as secondary considerations. One of the key insights driving the revaluation was Nietzsche's recognition that different values might be appropriate for different types of people. Traditional morality had assumed that the same rules should apply to everyone regardless of their circumstances, abilities or goals. But Nietzsche argued that this one-size-fits-all approach was both unrealistic and harmful. A moral system that worked well for ordinary people might be constraining for exceptional individuals. Rules that were appropriate for maintaining social order might be inappropriate for promoting individual excellence. Values that help the weak and suffering might hinder the strong and creative. The revaluation would need to recognize this diversity and create multiple sets of values that could serve different purposes and different types of people. This did not mean that anything goes or that there were no standards at all. It meant that standards needed to be more sophisticated and flexible than traditional morality had allowed. They needed to take into account the full complexity of human nature and human society. The revaluation would also need to address the question of who should be responsible for creating new values. In the past, moral systems had usually been created by religious leaders who claimed to receive their authority from God. But in a world where divine authority was no longer credible, some other source of legitimacy would be needed. Nietzsche believed that this responsibility would fall to a new type of philosopher that he called free spirits. These would be individuals who had freed themselves from conventional thinking and had the intellectual courage to question everything. They would combine rigorous thinking with artistic creativity to imagine new possibilities for human existence. They would be neither followers of tradition nor rebels against it, but creators of entirely new traditions. They would take on the enormous responsibility of providing moral guidance for humanity without claiming any supernatural authority for their ideas. Their legitimacy would come from the practical results of their value creation rather than from any external source. People would follow their guidance because it worked, not because they were commanded to do so. The process of revaluation would be gradual and experimental rather than sudden and dogmatic. New values would need to be tested in practice before they could be widely adopted. Some experiments would succeed while others would fail, and the successful ones would gradually spread through society. This would be a messier and more uncertain process than simply following established traditions, but it would also be more honest and more likely to produce values that actually served human needs. It would require people to take much more personal responsibility for their moral choices rather than simply obeying external authorities. But it would also give them much more freedom to create lives that were authentic and fulfilling. The revaluation of all values was therefore not just an intellectual project, but a practical program for creating a better future for humanity. It was Nietzsche's most ambitious vision of what philosophy could accomplish when it was oriented toward life and growth rather than abstract speculation. Part 9. Amor Fati. Among all of Nietzsche's concepts, Amor Fati, or love of fate, represents perhaps his most profound and challenging teaching about how to live. This Latin phrase literally means loving your fate, but it encompasses much more than simple acceptance or resignation. Amor Fati involves actively embracing everything that has happened in your life, everything that is happening now, and everything that will happen in the future. It means saying yes to your entire existence with such completeness that you would not change even the smallest detail if you had the power to do so. This attitude goes far beyond what most people consider possible or desirable. It asks us to love not just the good parts of our lives, but also the painful, difficult and tragic parts. It demands that we find a way to be grateful even for our failures, losses and sufferings. For Nietzsche, developing this capacity was essential for achieving genuine happiness and psychological health. Most people relate to their lives with a mixture of acceptance and resistance. They enjoy the pleasant experiences and try to avoid or escape from the unpleasant ones. They feel grateful for their successes and resentful about their failures. They wish they could keep the good parts of their past and erase the bad parts. This selective approach to experience seems natural and reasonable, but Nietzsche argued that it actually prevents people from fully living. When we resist parts of our experience, we split ourselves into competing factions. Part of us wants to move forward while another part remains stuck in regret about the past or anxiety about the future. Part of us appreciates what we have while another part focuses on what we lack. This internal conflict drains our energy and prevents us from engaging wholeheartedly with whatever is actually happening in our lives. We become spectators of our own existence rather than full participants. Amor Fati offers a way to heal this split and achieve internal unity. When we truly love our fate, we stop fighting against reality and start working with it instead. We recognize that everything that has happened to us, both positive and negative, has contributed to making us who we are. Our mistakes have taught us important lessons that we could not have learned any other way. Our suffering has developed our capacity for empathy and compassion. Our failures have revealed weaknesses that we needed to address. Our losses have helped us appreciate what we still have. Even our most painful experiences have played essential roles in our growth and development. From this perspective, nothing in our lives has been wasted or meaningless. Everything has been necessary for bringing us to where we are now. This does not mean that we should seek out suffering or remain passive in the face of difficulties. Amor Fati is not masochism or fatalism. We should still work to improve our circumstances and avoid unnecessary pain when possible. But we should do so from a place of love and gratitude rather than resentment and desperation. When we truly love our fate, we approach challenges as opportunities for growth rather than obstacles to happiness. We see setbacks as chances to develop resilience rather than reasons for despair. We treat difficult people as teachers who help us practice patience and understanding. We view uncertainty as an adventure rather than a threat. This shift in perspective transforms our entire relationship with existence. Instead of feeling like victims of circumstances beyond our control, we become active collaborators with whatever life brings us. Developing Amor Fati requires a fundamental change in how we think about the relationship between happiness and external conditions. Most people believe that they can only be happy when their circumstances are favorable and their desires are satisfied. They spend their lives trying to manipulate their environment to produce the experiences they want and avoid the experiences they fear. But this approach makes happiness dependent on factors that are largely beyond our control. Other people, economic conditions, health issues, and countless other variables can disrupt our plans and frustrate our efforts. We end up feeling anxious about threats to our well-being and disappointed when things do not work out as we hoped. Amor Fati offers an alternative approach that makes happiness independent of external circumstances. When we love our fate completely, we can find joy and meaning in any situation because we see every experience as valuable and necessary. This transformation is closely connected to Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence. If we truly believed that our lives would be repeated exactly the same way an infinite number of times, would we be able to embrace this reality with joy? The person who has achieved Amor Fati would answer yes without hesitation. They would want to live their life exactly as they have lived it because they see beauty and meaning in the whole story, not just in selected chapters. They understand that editing out the difficult parts would also eliminate the growth, wisdom and compassion that came from facing those difficulties. They would rather have a complete human experience that includes both joy and sorrow than a sanitized version that contains only pleasure. This preference reveals a mature understanding of what makes life truly valuable and worthwhile. It shows that they have moved beyond childish demands for constant gratification toward an adult appreciation for the full range of human experience. Amor Fati also has important implications for how we relate to other people. When we love our own fate completely, we become much more accepting of others and their choices. We realize that everyone is dealing with their own unique set of circumstances and challenges. We stop trying to fix other people or make them conform to our expectations. We appreciate them as they are rather than focusing on how we think they should be. This does not mean that we become passive or stop offering help when it is needed and wanted. But it does mean that we approach relationships from a place of love and acceptance rather than judgment and control. We see other people's struggles as necessary parts of their journey rather than problems that need to be solved. We trust that they have the capacity to learn and grow from their experiences just as we have learned and grown from ours. This attitude creates much healthier and more satisfying relationships than the alternative approach of trying to manage and manipulate others. For Nietzsche, Amor Fati represented the highest achievement possible for human consciousness. It demonstrated complete psychological maturity and spiritual strength. The person who could genuinely love their fate had transcended the ordinary human tendency to resist reality and demand that life conform to their preferences. They had learned to find meaning and beauty in existence as it actually is, rather than as they wish it could be. They had achieved what he considered true freedom, which comes not from getting what you want, but from wanting what you get. This freedom is available to anyone, regardless of their external circumstances, because it depends on internal transformation rather than external manipulation. It represents the ultimate victory of human consciousness over the limitations and difficulties that are inherent in the human condition. For this reason, Nietzsche saw Amor Fati as both a practical teaching for individuals and a spiritual goal for all of humanity. Part 10. Perspectivism. One of Nietzsche's most influential contributions to philosophy was his development of what scholars now call perspectivism. This concept challenges the traditional assumption that there is one objective truth about reality that can be discovered through reason, observation, or revelation. Instead, Nietzsche argued that all knowledge is inevitably shaped by the perspective of the knower. Every person, culture, and historical period approaches the world from a particular point of view that influences what they see and how they interpret their experiences. There's no view from nowhere, no God's eye perspective that reveals things as they truly are, independent of any observer. This does not mean that all perspectives are equally valid, or that truth is completely relative. Some viewpoints are more useful, more comprehensive, or more life-affirming than others. But it does mean that we need to be much more humble and self-aware about the limitations of our own understanding. Traditional philosophy had assumed that the goal of thinking was to discover eternal truths that would be valid for all people in all times and places. Plato believed in perfect forms that existed beyond the physical world. Christians believed in divine revelations that provided absolute moral guidance. Scientists believed in natural laws that governed the universe according to mathematical principles. Even secular philosophers like Kant believed in universal categories of thought that structured all possible human experience. Nietzsche questioned all of these assumptions and argued that what we call truth is actually a collection of useful fictions that help us navigate the world. These fictions work well enough for practical purposes, but they should not be confused with ultimate reality. They are tools for living rather than mirrors of eternal truth. The development of Perspectivism was influenced by several intellectual trends of Nietzsche's time. Historical research was revealing how much human beliefs and practices had changed over time. Anthropological studies were showing the incredible diversity of human cultures and value systems. Advances in psychology were demonstrating how much unconscious factors influenced conscious thought. The theory of evolution was suggesting that human mental capacities had developed for survival rather than truth-seeking. All of these discoveries undermined confidence in the ability of human reason to achieve objective knowledge. If our minds were shaped by evolutionary pressures, cultural conditioning and unconscious drives, how could we trust them to reveal the ultimate nature of reality? Nietzsche concluded that we needed to abandon the quest for absolute truth and focus instead on developing perspectives that served life and growth. Perspectivism has important implications for how we think about scientific knowledge. Science had often been seen as the one form of human inquiry that could transcend cultural limitations and achieve objective truth. But Nietzsche argued that even scientific theories are shaped by the interests, assumptions and limitations of the people who create them. Scientists choose which questions to investigate based on what seems important to them and their society. They interpret their observations through conceptual frameworks that they have inherited from their training and culture. They design experiments that test hypotheses that make sense within their existing worldview. The results they obtain are therefore not pure reflections of nature, but interactions between natural phenomena and human concepts. This does not make science worthless or arbitrary, but it does make it more humble and provisional than many people assume. Scientific theories should be evaluated based on their usefulness for prediction and control rather than their correspondence to absolute truth. They are tools that help us manipulate the world rather than windows that show us reality as it truly is. The same analysis applies to moral and political beliefs. Most people assume that their values are obviously correct, and that anyone who disagrees with them is either ignorant or evil. But Perspectivism suggests that moral disagreements often reflect different starting assumptions and different life experiences rather than differences in intelligence or character. Someone who has lived through war might have very different ideas about peace than someone who has always lived in safety. Someone who has experienced poverty might have different views about economic policy than someone who has always been wealthy. Someone who belongs to a minority group might have different perspectives on justice than someone who belongs to the majority. These differences do not necessarily mean that one side is right and the other is wrong. They might mean that different moral systems serve different needs and circumstances. Understanding this can help us approach political and ethical disagreements with more humility and less self-righteousness. It can also help us learn from people who see the world differently than we do. Perspectivism also has important implications for personal development and self-knowledge. Most people think they know themselves pretty well and understand their own motivations and desires. But Nietzsche argued that self-knowledge is just as limited and perspective-bound as knowledge of the external world. We see ourselves from a particular point of view that is shaped by our upbringing, our culture, and our current circumstances. We have blind spots and biases that prevent us from seeing ourselves clearly. We rationalize our behavior and create flattering stories about our motivations. We focus on some aspects of our personality while ignoring others. Recognizing these limitations can actually help us achieve better self-understanding. If we know that our self-perception is incomplete and biased, we can work to expand it by seeking feedback from others, examining our behavior more carefully, and considering alternative explanations for our actions. We can also experiment with different ways of thinking about ourselves and see which ones lead to better outcomes. One of the most important applications of Perspectivism concerns the question of meaning and purpose in life. Many people assume that life either has an objective meaning that can be discovered or no meaning at all. But Perspectivism suggests a third possibility, which is that meaning is created through the interaction between individuals and their circumstances. Different people in different situations will naturally find different things meaningful based on their values, goals, and experiences. What matters is not whether these meanings correspond to some ultimate truth about the purpose of existence, but whether they help people live fulfilling and productive lives. This approach gives individuals much more freedom and responsibility for creating their own sense of purpose. They do not need to wait for someone else to tell them what their life should mean or worry about whether they have discovered the one true purpose. They can actively construct meanings that serve their deepest values and help them contribute something valuable to the world. However, Perspectivism does not lead to complete relativism or the conclusion that all viewpoints are equally good. Some perspectives are more comprehensive, more consistent, more useful, or more life-affirming than others. The goal is not to eliminate all standards for evaluation, but to make those standards more sophisticated and context-sensitive. We can judge perspectives based on their practical consequences rather than their correspondence to absolute truth. We can ask whether they help people flourish, whether they promote cooperation and creativity, whether they lead to beautiful and meaningful lives. We can also ask whether they are internally consistent and whether they take into account the full complexity of human experience. The best perspectives will be those that serve life and growth while remaining honest about their own limitations and open to revision when better alternatives emerge. Perspectivism, therefore, does not eliminate the possibility of making judgments, but makes those judgments more thoughtful and more humble. Part 11. The Apollonian and Dionysian. Early in his philosophical career, Nietzsche developed one of his most enduring insights about human nature and culture through his analysis of ancient Greek art and religion. In his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, he identified two fundamental forces that shape all human creativity and experience. He called these forces the Apollonian and the Dionysian, naming them after two Greek gods who represented very different approaches to life. Apollo was the god of reason, order, beauty, and individual identity. Dionysus was the god of wine, ecstasy, chaos, and the dissolution of boundaries. Nietzsche argued that both forces were necessary for creating great art and living a full human life. The tension and interplay between them generated the energy that made Greek civilization so creative and powerful. But modern Western culture had become dangerously one-sided by emphasizing Apollonian values while suppressing Dionysian ones. The Apollonian represents everything that gives form, structure, and meaning to human experience. It is the force that creates beautiful objects, rational arguments, moral principles, and individual personalities. It seeks clarity, harmony, proportion, and perfection. It wants to understand the world by analyzing it into distinct parts and discovering the rules that govern their relationships. It creates boundaries between self and other, good and evil, beautiful and ugly. It builds institutions, traditions and customs that provide stability and continuity across generations. Without the Apollonian, human life would be chaotic and meaningless. We would have no language to communicate with each other, no laws to govern our behavior, and no standards to guide our choices. We would be overwhelmed by the raw intensity of existence and unable to create anything lasting or valuable. The Apollonian therefore provides the framework within which human civilization becomes possible. But Nietzsche believed that the Apollonian alone was insufficient for creating great art or living a truly fulfilling life. Pure reason and order produce work that is technically perfect, but emotionally cold and spiritually dead. People who live entirely within Apollonian boundaries become rigid, calculating, and cut off from the deeper sources of creativity and passion. They follow rules and conventions, but lack the spontaneity and vitality that make life exciting and meaningful. They create beautiful forms, but fill them with empty content. They achieve external success, but remain internally hollow. This is why the Dionysian element is equally necessary for human flourishing. It provides the energy, passion, and creative chaos that gives life to Apollonian forms. The Dionysian represents the wild, irrational, and ecstatic aspects of human nature. It is the force that dissolves boundaries and merges the individual with something larger than themselves. It expresses itself through music, dance, intoxication, sexual passion, and religious ecstasy. It seeks intensity of experience rather than clarity of understanding. It embraces contradiction, paradox, and mystery rather than trying to resolve them through logic. It celebrates the body, the emotions, and the unconscious rather than privileging the mind and rational thought. It connects us to the natural world and to the animal aspects of our being. It reminds us that we are not just thinking machines, but living creatures embedded in the flow of life and death. Without the Dionysian, human existence becomes sterile and artificial. We lose touch with our deepest sources of motivation and meaning. The greatest achievements in art and culture occur when Apollonian and Dionysian forces work together rather than against each other. Greek tragedy represented the perfect fusion of these two principles. The stories dealt with the most intense and chaotic human experiences like love, betrayal, revenge, and death. These Dionysian themes were given Apollonian form through beautiful poetry, structured plots, and philosophical reflection. The result was art that was both emotionally powerful and intellectually sophisticated. It spoke to the whole human being rather than just to reason or just to passion. It helped audiences experience and process the deepest mysteries of existence in a way that was both cathartic and enlightening. This synthesis of order and chaos, form and content, reason and emotion, created works of lasting beauty and meaning. But Nietzsche argued that this balance had been destroyed by the influence of Socratic rationalism and Christian morality. Starting with Socrates, Western philosophy had become suspicious of emotion, instinct, and everything that could not be rationally justified. The goal of life was redefined as the pursuit of knowledge rather than the creation of beauty or the achievement of excellence. Truth became more important than art, and logic became more valuable than intuition. Christianity reinforced this trend by teaching people to distrust their bodies and their natural desires. The flesh was seen as sinful and the spirit as pure. Reason was elevated as the faculty that could discern God's will, while passion was condemned as the source of temptation and error. The result was a culture that was increasingly one-sided and life-denying. Modern European civilization reflected this imbalance in countless ways. Science and technology had achieved remarkable success by applying Apollonian principles of analysis, measurement and control. But this success had come at the cost of alienating people from nature and from their own deeper selves. Industrial society was efficient and productive, but also mechanical and dehumanizing. Education focused on transmitting information and developing logical thinking, while neglecting creativity and emotional development. Art had become either coldly classical or sentimentally romantic, rather than achieving the tragic synthesis of the Greeks. Religion had become moralistic and abstract, rather than ecstatic and transformative. People were living longer and more comfortable lives, but were also more bored, anxious, and spiritually empty than their ancestors. Nietzsche believed that recovering the Dionysian was essential for renewing Western culture and helping individuals live more complete lives. This did not mean abandoning reason, order, and moral standards in favor of pure chaos and self-indulgence. Instead, it meant finding ways to integrate passion and reason, body and mind, individual and universal. It meant creating new forms of art, philosophy, and life that could honor both sides of human nature. It meant learning to celebrate our animal heritage while also developing our uniquely human capacities for reflection and creativity. It meant embracing intensity and risk rather than always choosing safety and predictability. Most importantly, it meant recognizing that the goal of life was not just to understand the world, but to experience it fully and create something beautiful from that experience. The person who could successfully integrate Apollonian and Dionysian elements would be capable of both great art and great living. This integration was particularly important for individuals seeking to live authentic and fulfilling lives. Most people were either too Apollonian or too Dionysian in their approach to existence. Those who were overly Apollonian lived according to rigid rules and plans, but lacked spontaneity and passion. They achieved their goals, but did not enjoy the process of achieving them. Those who were overly Dionysian lived intensely but chaotically, and were unable to create anything lasting or meaningful. They had great experiences but could not integrate them into a coherent sense of purpose or identity. The ideal was to develop both capacities and learn when to apply each one. Sometimes life required careful planning, logical analysis, and disciplined effort. Other times it required letting go of control, trusting instinct, and embracing uncertainty. The art of living involved knowing which approach was appropriate for each situation and being able to move fluidly between them as circumstances demanded. This flexibility and wholeness was what Nietzsche admired most about the ancient Greeks and what he hoped modern people could learn to recover. It represented not a return to the past, but a movement toward a richer and more complete form of humanity. Part 12. Nihilism. Nihilism was perhaps the greatest threat that Nietzsche saw facing European civilization in his time. This philosophical position holds that life has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. Nothing we do ultimately matters because there is no objective standard by which to judge our actions or their consequences. All human beliefs, values, and institutions are arbitrary constructions with no foundation in reality. Traditional sources of meaning like religion, morality, and culture are revealed to be human inventions rather than eternal truths. When people fully grasp these implications, they may conclude that existence itself is pointless and that there is no reason to continue striving or caring about anything. Nietzsche did not embrace nihilism as a desirable outcome, but rather diagnosed it as an inevitable stage in the development of Western thought. He believed that understanding nihilism was essential for eventually overcoming it and creating new sources of meaning and value. The emergence of nihilism was not an accident, but the logical result of intellectual developments that had been building for centuries. The scientific revolution had shown that the universe operated according to natural laws rather than divine providence. The Earth was not the centre of creation, but a small planet orbiting an ordinary star in a vast and seemingly empty cosmos. Human beings were not special creatures made in God's image, but products of evolutionary processes that operated through blind variation and natural selection. Historical criticism had revealed that religious texts were written and edited by human beings with their own agendas and limitations. Anthropological research had shown that different cultures had completely different ideas about morality, meaning, and the good life. All of these discoveries undermined confidence in traditional beliefs and left educated people without clear guidance about how to live or what to value. The more they learned about the world, the less meaningful it seemed to become. Nihilism manifested itself in different ways among different types of people. Some responded with despair and concluded that life was not worth living. If nothing mattered and everything was ultimately meaningless, then why continue struggling and suffering? They might become depressed, suicidal, or simply withdraw from active participation in life. Others responded with hedonistic indulgence and decided to pursue pleasure and avoid pain without worrying about higher purposes. If there were no absolute moral standards, then they might as well do whatever felt good in the moment. Still, others responded with cynical detachment and treated all human ideals and aspirations as jokes or illusions. They might become critics who specialized in exposing the weaknesses and contradictions in other people's beliefs without offering any positive alternatives. All of these responses reflected an inability to create new sources of meaning to replace the old ones that had been destroyed. People were left in a state of spiritual paralysis, unable to move forward, but also unable to return to beliefs they no longer found credible. Nietzsche distinguished between different types of nihilism and argued that some were more dangerous than others. Passive nihilism involved giving up on life and retreating into resignation or escapism. People who fell into passive nihilism stopped trying to achieve anything significant and instead focused on minimizing suffering and maintaining comfort. They might become what he called last men who were content with mediocrity and had no aspirations for greatness or excellence. Active nihilism involved a more aggressive rejection of existing values accompanied by destructive behavior. People who embraced active nihilism might tear down institutions, attack social norms, and engage in violence without having any positive vision to replace what they destroyed. Both forms of nihilism were symptoms of cultural decline, but active nihilism was at least honest about the magnitude of the crisis and might eventually lead to creative breakthroughs. Passive nihilism was more insidious because it disguised despair as contentment and prevented people from confronting the real depth of their situation. The most dangerous form of nihilism was what Nietzsche called incomplete nihilism. This occurred when people lost faith in traditional values but tried to maintain their old way of life by clinging to empty forms and rituals. They might continue going to church without really believing in God or following moral rules without understanding why those rules existed. They might pursue career success, material wealth, or social status as substitutes for the deeper meanings they had lost. This created a culture of hypocrisy and self-deception where people pretended to believe things they actually doubted. It was worse than honest nihilism because it prevented people from recognizing their situation clearly and taking steps to address it. Incomplete nihilists were neither fully alive nor fully dead, but existed in a kind of spiritual limbo that Nietzsche found particularly disturbing. They had lost their old values, but lacked the courage to admit this loss and create new ones. But Nietzsche did not see nihilism as an insurmountable problem or a reason for despair. Instead, he viewed it as a necessary stage that humanity needed to pass through in order to reach higher levels of development. Just as individuals often had to experience crisis and breakdown before they could grow and mature, civilizations might need to confront the meaninglessness of their inherited beliefs before they could create better ones. Nihilism was like a fever that burned away diseased tissue so that healthy new growth could emerge. It was painful, but ultimately beneficial because it cleared away illusions and forced people to take responsibility for creating their own meanings and values. The alternative to going through nihilism was remaining trapped in traditions that no longer served their original purposes. Better to face the truth about the human condition honestly than to live in comfortable but ultimately hollow self-deception. This required tremendous courage because it meant giving up the security of inherited beliefs without any guarantee that adequate replacements could be found. The key to overcoming nihilism was not to find new absolute truths to replace the old ones, but to develop the capacity to create meaning and value through human will and creativity. This was the task that Nietzsche assigned to what he called free spirits and eventually to the Übermensch. These exceptional individuals would not wait for someone else to tell them what life should mean, but would take responsibility for defining their own purposes and values. They would understand that meaning was not something to be discovered, but something to be created through action, art, and commitment. They would be strong enough to live without absolute certainties and creative enough to build fulfilling lives from whatever materials were available to them. Their example would eventually inspire others to follow similar paths, and gradually a new culture would emerge that was based on human creativity rather than divine command or natural law. This transition would not be easy, and not everyone would be capable of making it successfully. Many people needed the guidance and comfort provided by traditional belief systems and would never be able to function well without them. They might always require some form of religion, ideology, or authority to tell them how to live and what to value. But a few exceptional individuals would be able to create new forms of meaning that could eventually benefit everyone. These value creators would be like artists who discovered new forms of beauty, or scientists who revealed new truths about nature. Their innovations would gradually spread through society and become the foundation for healthier and more life-affirming cultures. The process might take generations or even centuries to complete, but it was the only way for humanity to move beyond the crisis of nihilism toward a more mature and creative form of existence. Nihilism was therefore not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter in human development. Part 13. The Free Spirit. Throughout his writings, Nietzsche celebrated a particular type of person that he called the free spirit. This individual represented his ideal of intellectual and moral independence, someone who had liberated themselves from the conventional thinking of their time and culture. The free spirit was not someone who simply rebelled against authority or rejected all traditions out of spite. Instead, they were someone who had developed the courage and ability to think for themselves about fundamental questions of meaning, value, and truth. They could examine inherited beliefs with critical intelligence while also being open to new possibilities and perspectives. They represented what human beings could become if they had the strength to break free from the herd mentality that dominated most people's thinking. For Nietzsche, the free spirit was both a psychological type that already existed in rare individuals and a goal that more people could potentially achieve through education and self-development. They were the pioneers who would lead humanity toward a more mature and creative future. The journey towards becoming a free spirit typically began with a period of doubt and questioning that Nietzsche called the liberation of the spirit. Most people were raised within particular cultural traditions that provided them with ready-made answers to life's big questions. They learned what to believe about God, morality, politics, and the meaning of existence from their families, schools, and communities. These beliefs felt natural and obvious because they were reinforced by everyone around them. But some individuals eventually began to wonder whether these inherited ideas were actually true or just convenient fictions. They might notice contradictions between different beliefs they had been taught or conflicts between their values and their experiences. They might encounter people from other cultures who had completely different ideas about fundamental questions, or they might simply develop enough intellectual curiosity to want to examine their beliefs more carefully. This questioning process was often painful because it involved giving up the security and comfort of unexamined certainties, but it was necessary for anyone who wanted to achieve genuine understanding rather than mere conformity. The liberation process typically involved several distinct stages that could take years or even decades to complete. First came the recognition that many beliefs they had taken for granted were actually questionable or even false. This could be a shocking and disorienting experience that left them feeling lost and confused. Next came a period of systematic doubt and criticism, during which they examined all of their inherited ideas to determine which ones could withstand scrutiny. This was followed by a phase of experimentation with new ideas and ways of living. They might try on different philosophical systems, moral codes, or lifestyle choices to see which ones worked best for them. Finally, if they were successful, they would reach a stage of creative synthesis, where they could integrate the best insights from different traditions while discarding what was outdated or harmful. They would emerge from this process with a worldview that was genuinely their own rather than simply borrowed from others. They would become free spirits who could think independently while still learning from the wisdom of the past. Not everyone who began this journey would complete it successfully, but those who did would achieve a kind of intellectual and spiritual maturity that was rare and valuable. One of the key characteristics of free spirits was their intellectual honesty and willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Most people preferred beliefs that made them feel good about themselves and their place in the world. They wanted to think that they were fundamentally good people living in a meaningful universe that cared about their welfare. Free spirits were willing to consider the possibility that these comforting beliefs might be illusions. They could acknowledge their own limitations, mistakes, and moral failings without becoming paralyzed by guilt or shame. They could accept that the universe might be indifferent to human concerns without falling into despair. They could recognize that their own culture and historical period were not necessarily superior to others without becoming paralyzed by relativism. This intellectual courage allowed them to see reality more clearly than people who filtered everything through wishful thinking. It also freed them from wasting energy on defending false beliefs or pursuing impossible goals. They could focus their efforts on understanding and working with the world as it actually was, rather than as they wished it to be. Free spirits also demonstrated remarkable psychological flexibility and adaptability. Because they were not rigidly attached to any particular set of beliefs or practices, they could modify their thinking when they encountered new evidence or arguments. They could learn from people who disagreed with them and incorporate valuable insights from unexpected sources. They could change their minds without feeling that they were betraying their identity or admitting weakness. This openness to growth and change allowed them to continue developing throughout their lives rather than becoming stuck in patterns they had established in their youth. It also made them more creative and innovative because they were not constrained by conventional assumptions about what was possible or appropriate. They could imagine new solutions to old problems and new ways of organizing human life. They were natural experimenters who were willing to try different approaches and learn from both their successes and their failures. Another important quality of free spirits was their independence from the need for social approval and conformity. Most people shaped their beliefs and behaviors to fit in with their peer groups and avoid criticism or rejection. They wanted to be liked and accepted, so they said and did what others expected of them. Free spirits had developed enough inner strength and self-confidence to stand alone when necessary. They could express unpopular opinions, pursue unconventional goals, and live according to their own standards, even when others disapproved. This did not mean that they were antisocial or indifferent to other people's feelings. They could be kind, generous and cooperative when these qualities served good purposes. But they did not sacrifice their integrity or authenticity for the sake of popularity. They understood that genuine friendship and love were only possible between people who were honest about who they really were. They preferred to be respected for their real qualities rather than admired for false ones. Free spirits also possessed what Nietzsche called intellectual probity, or a commitment to rigorous thinking and careful reasoning. They were not content with sloppy arguments, wishful thinking, or emotional appeals that bypassed rational analysis. When they encountered claims about truth or value, they asked for evidence and examined the logic carefully. They were willing to suspend judgment when the evidence was insufficient and to admit uncertainty when they did not know something. They distinguished between what they hoped was true and what they had good reasons to believe was true. They were suspicious of their own biases and tried to correct for them through self-criticism and exposure to different perspectives. This intellectual discipline allowed them to avoid many of the errors and self-deceptions that trapped less careful thinkers. It also earned them credibility with other serious people who recognized the quality of their thinking. Perhaps most importantly, free spirits had developed the capacity for what Nietzsche called self-creation or self-overcoming. Instead of simply accepting themselves as they were or trying to conform to external standards, they actively worked to become the people they wanted to be. They took responsibility for their own development and growth, rather than waiting for others to change them or improve their circumstances. They set high standards for themselves and worked persistently to meet those standards. They treated their own lives as works of art that they were constantly refining and improving. This process of self-creation required both self-knowledge and self-discipline. They needed to understand their own strengths, weaknesses, and potential in order to make realistic plans for improvement. They also needed the willpower and persistence to follow through on those plans, even when the work was difficult or boring. The result was individuals who had consciously shaped themselves rather than simply been shaped by external forces. They had become free not just in their thinking but in their very being, liberated from the limitations that most people accepted as permanent and unchangeable. Part 14. Herd Mentality. One of Nietzsche's most penetrating insights concerned what he called the herd mentality that dominated most human thinking and behavior. He observed that the vast majority of people did not truly think for themselves, but instead adopted the beliefs, values, and practices of whatever group they belonged to. Like animals in a herd who follow the leader and stay close together for safety, most humans sought security through conformity and consensus. They were more concerned with fitting in than with discovering truth or developing their own unique perspectives. This tendency was not necessarily evil or contemptible, but it did prevent people from achieving their full potential as individuals. It also created societies that were stable and predictable, but lacking in creativity and excellence. Nietzsche saw the herd mentality as one of the greatest obstacles to human development and believed that overcoming it was essential for anyone who wanted to live an authentic and meaningful life. Understanding how this mentality operated was therefore crucial for anyone seeking genuine independence and self-realization. The herd mentality emerged from deep-seated psychological needs that were rooted in human evolution. For millions of years, humans had survived by living in small groups that provided protection from predators, help with finding food, and assistance in raising children. Individuals who could cooperate effectively with others were more likely to survive and reproduce than those who were isolated or antisocial. This created strong psychological pressures toward conformity, obedience, and group loyalty. People who deviated too much from group norms risked being expelled or punished, which could mean death in harsh natural environments. Over time, humans developed powerful instincts to monitor what others were thinking and doing, and to adjust their own behavior accordingly. These instincts served important survival functions in primitive societies, but could become problematic in more complex civilizations where conformity was not always beneficial. Modern people retained these ancient psychological patterns even when they were no longer necessary or appropriate. The herd mentality manifested itself in countless ways in contemporary life. People tended to adopt the political opinions of their families, friends, and communities without examining the underlying issues carefully. They followed fashion trends and consumer preferences not because these things truly reflected their personal tastes, but because they wanted to signal their membership in particular social groups. They chose careers and lifestyles that would earn approval from others rather than pursuing their own deepest interests and talents. They avoided expressing controversial opinions or engaging in unconventional behavior that might make them stand out or attract criticism. They gossiped about and shunned people who violated social norms, even when those violations caused no real harm to anyone. They derived their sense of identity and self-worth primarily from their roles as group members, rather than from their individual achievements or qualities. All of these behaviors reflected the deep human need to belong and to feel accepted by others. While these conformist tendencies served some positive functions, they also came with significant costs. When everyone thought and acted in similar ways, societies became stagnant and resistant to change. New ideas that challenged existing assumptions were often rejected or suppressed before they could be properly evaluated. Creative individuals who might have contributed valuable innovations were discouraged from pursuing their unique visions. Problems that required unconventional solutions went unsolved because no one was willing to think outside established patterns. Groups could maintain unity and harmony, but they often did so at the expense of growth and improvement. The herd mentality also made people vulnerable to manipulation by leaders who understood how to appeal to their desire for belonging and security. Demagogues could rally support for harmful policies by convincing people that these policies were supported by the majority or by the group's traditional enemies. Individuals lost their capacity for independent judgment and became tools in the hands of those who knew how to exploit their conformist instincts. The result was societies that were emotionally satisfying for their members, but intellectually and morally mediocre. Nietzsche was particularly concerned about how the herd mentality affected the development of exceptional individuals who had the potential to make significant contributions to human knowledge and culture. These rare people often thought differently from the majority and pursued goals that others did not understand or value. If they succumbed to pressure to conform, their unique gifts would be wasted, and humanity would lose the benefits of their creativity. But if they resisted conformity, they often faced isolation, persecution, and failure to achieve their goals. History was full of examples of artists, scientists, philosophers, and reformers who were rejected by their contemporaries and only recognized after their deaths. The herd mentality created a systematic bias against innovation and excellence that harmed both individuals and society as a whole. It rewarded mediocrity and punished greatness, leading to what Nietzsche saw as a gradual decline in human quality and achievement. Exceptional individuals needed to understand these dynamics so they could protect themselves while still finding ways to contribute their gifts to the world. The influence of the herd mentality was not limited to obvious examples of peer pressure and social conformity. It also operated at deeper levels that people were often unaware of. The language people used to think and communicate had been shaped by generations of collective usage and carried embedded assumptions about reality and value. The concepts and categories they used to understand the world reflected the particular historical and cultural circumstances of their society. Even their most basic beliefs about logic, evidence, and rationality were influenced by intellectual traditions that had been developed and refined through social processes. This meant that even people who thought they were thinking independently were actually thinking within frameworks that had been created by the herd. True intellectual freedom required becoming aware of these deeper influences and learning to question not just particular beliefs, but the entire conceptual apparatus through which those beliefs were formed. This was an extremely difficult task that few people were capable of undertaking successfully. Overcoming the herd mentality required developing what Nietzsche called intellectual courage and spiritual strength. Individuals needed to be willing to stand alone when necessary and to endure the discomfort of uncertainty and social disapproval. They needed to cultivate their own judgment and learn to trust their own perceptions even when these conflicted with popular opinion. They needed to develop enough inner security and self-confidence to resist the pressure to conform to external expectations. This process often involved a period of isolation and alienation as people separated themselves from the groups that had previously defined their identity. They might lose friends, disappoint family members, and find themselves excluded from social circles that had once provided comfort and support. But if they persevered through this difficult transition, they could emerge as genuinely independent individuals who were capable of original thinking and authentic living. They would become what Nietzsche called free spirits, who could contribute something unique and valuable to the world. However, Nietzsche did not advocate for complete rejection of all social influence or total isolation from other people. Even the most independent individuals needed to learn from others and benefit from human cooperation and companionship. The goal was not to eliminate social influence, but to become more selective and conscious about which influences to accept and which to reject. Free spirits could appreciate the wisdom of traditions while still maintaining their right to evaluate and modify those traditions. They could form meaningful relationships with others while still preserving their individual autonomy and authenticity. They could contribute to social institutions while still maintaining their independence of thought and action. The key was to achieve a balance between social connection and individual freedom that allowed for both personal development and positive contributions to the larger human community. This balance was delicate and required constant attention and adjustment, but it was essential for anyone who wanted to live as a fully realized human being rather than merely as a member of the herd. Part 15. The Death of Tragedy. In his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche presented a revolutionary analysis of why ancient Greek culture had been so extraordinarily creative and why modern European culture seemed comparatively weak and lifeless. He argued that the Greeks had achieved a perfect balance between two fundamental forces in human nature that he called the Apollonian and the Dionysian. This balance had found its highest expression in Greek tragedy, an art form that combined rational structure with emotional intensity, beautiful form with chaotic content. But this achievement had been destroyed by the rise of Socratic rationalism and had never been successfully restored. The death of tragedy represented not just the loss of a particular art form, but the beginning of a cultural decline that was still affecting European civilization in Nietzsche's time. Understanding what had been lost and why was essential for anyone who wanted to help create a healthier and more vital culture. Greek tragedy emerged during the 6th and 5th centuries before Christ as part of religious festivals honoring the god Dionysus. These festivals combined elements of worship, celebration, and artistic performance in ways that engaged the entire community. The tragedies themselves dealt with the most fundamental questions of human existence through stories drawn from mythology and legend. Characters faced impossible choices between conflicting duties, suffered terrible fates despite their best efforts, and struggled with forces beyond their control. The plays did not offer easy answers or happy endings, but instead forced audiences to confront the inherent tragedy and mystery of the human condition. Yet they did so in ways that were beautiful, uplifting, and ultimately affirmative of life despite its difficulties. This combination of honesty about suffering with celebration of existence was what made Greek tragedy so powerful and unique. It neither minimized the reality of pain nor despaired about the possibility of meaning and beauty. The secret of Greek tragedy's success lay in its fusion of Apollonian and Dionysian elements. The Dionysian provided the raw emotional power that made the stories so compelling and emotionally affecting. Audiences experienced intense feelings of pity, fear, ecstasy and catharsis as they witnessed the struggles of the characters. They were connected to the primitive and irrational aspects of human nature that civilized life usually kept hidden or suppressed. But these powerful emotions were given shape and meaning through Apollonian elements like beautiful poetry, structured plots, and philosophical reflection. The chaos of feeling was transformed into artistic order without being diminished or domesticated. The result was an experience that spoke to the whole human being rather than just to reason or just to emotion. People left the theatre feeling both purged of negative emotions and inspired by the beauty and nobility they had witnessed. They had been reminded of both the fragility and the greatness of human existence. This combination of emotional catharsis and intellectual stimulation created a form of wisdom that was practical as well as theoretical. But this perfect synthesis had been destroyed by what Nietzsche called the Socratic revolution in Greek thought. Starting with Socrates and continuing through Plato and later philosophers, reason had been elevated above all other human faculties. The goal of life was redefined as the pursuit of knowledge rather than the creation of beauty or the achievement of excellence. Truth became more important than art, and logic became more valuable than intuition. Mystery and contradiction were seen as problems to be solved, rather than aspects of reality to be celebrated and explored. This rational approach had many benefits and led to important advances in philosophy and science. But it also made it impossible to create the kind of tragic art that had been the glory of earlier Greek civilization. Once people believed that all problems could be solved through reason and that happiness could be achieved through knowledge, they lost the tragic sense of life that had inspired their greatest artistic achievements. The influence of Socratic rationalism was reinforced and extended by the rise of Christianity. Like Socratic philosophy, Christianity taught people to distrust their emotions and their physical nature. The body was seen as sinful and the spirit as pure. This world was treated as a temporary testing ground for the next world rather than as something valuable in itself. Suffering was either punishment for sin or a trial that would be rewarded in heaven. Beauty and artistic excellence were suspected of leading to pride and vanity. The result was a culture that was increasingly otherworldly and life-denying. People focused on moral improvement and spiritual salvation rather than on creating great art or achieving human excellence. The tragic view of life that had inspired the Greeks was replaced by a moralistic view that promised ultimate justice and happiness to those who followed the right rules. This made tragedy impossible because tragedy required accepting that life was inherently problematic and that some conflicts could never be resolved. The death of tragedy had far-reaching consequences for European culture. Without the tragic sense of life, art became either prettily classical or sentimentally romantic, but lost the profound depth that had characterized Greek drama. Philosophy became abstract and academic rather than engaging with the full complexity of human experience. Religion became moralistic and rational rather than ecstatic and transformative. People lost the ability to affirm life while simultaneously acknowledging its difficulties and contradictions. They either denied the reality of suffering through optimistic philosophies or became overwhelmed by it through pessimistic ones. They could no longer achieve the tragic synthesis that found beauty and meaning in struggle itself. This left them spiritually impoverished, despite their material and intellectual progress. They had gained scientific knowledge and moral refinement, but lost the capacity for the kind of deep joy and wisdom that comes from fully engaging with existence in all its complexity. They had become smaller and more fearful rather than larger and more courageous. Nietzsche believed that recovering the tragic sense of life was essential for the renewal of European culture. This did not mean simply imitating Greek drama or returning to ancient religious practices. Instead, it meant learning to create new forms of art and thought that could integrate reason and emotion, order and chaos, beauty and truth. It meant developing the intellectual courage to face reality without comforting illusions and the artistic skill to transform that reality into something beautiful and meaningful. It meant learning to say yes to life, despite its inevitable suffering and uncertainty. This was the task that Nietzsche set for himself and for others who shared his vision of cultural renewal. He hoped that by understanding what had been lost, people might be inspired to create something equally great but appropriate for their own time and circumstances. The death of tragedy was not irreversible if enough people had the will and ability to bring about its rebirth in new forms. This renewal would require individuals who combined the intellectual sophistication of modern education with the emotional depth and courage of the ancient Greeks. They would need to be both rational and passionate, both critical and creative. They would need to understand science and philosophy while also being capable of artistic inspiration and spiritual experience. They would need to be honest about the harsh realities of existence while also being committed to creating beauty and meaning from those realities. These exceptional individuals would be neither purely ancient nor purely modern, but something new that could synthesize the best of both traditions. They would be the creators of what Nietzsche hoped would be a new golden age of human culture. The death of tragedy would then be revealed not as an ending, but as a necessary stage in the development of something even greater and more life-affirming than what had been lost. This was Nietzsche's ultimate hope for the future of human civilization. Part 16. Power versus Force. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy concerns his ideas about power and strength. Many people have assumed that when he praised power and criticized weakness, he was advocating for crude domination, violence, and the oppression of others. This interpretation has been used to justify terrible historical crimes and has given Nietzsche a reputation as a dangerous and immoral thinker. But this completely misses his actual meaning and demonstrates a failure to understand the crucial distinction he made between genuine power and mere force. True power, as Nietzsche understood it, was creative, life-affirming, and self-directed rather than destructive, life-denying and focused on controlling others. It was the capacity to overcome obstacles, achieve excellence, and create value rather than simply the ability to hurt or intimidate people. Understanding this distinction is essential for grasping what Nietzsche actually taught, and why his ideas remain relevant for anyone seeking to live a strong and meaningful life. It also helps explain why he was so critical of many forms of behavior that appear strong on the surface but actually reflect deeper forms of weakness and inadequacy. Genuine power manifested itself primarily through self-mastery and self-creation. The most powerful individuals were those who could control their own impulses, emotions and reactions rather than being controlled by external circumstances. They could remain calm under pressure, think clearly in difficult situations, and pursue long-term goals despite temporary setbacks and distractions. They had the discipline to develop their talents and abilities through persistent effort and practice. They could delay gratification, tolerate uncertainty, and endure hardship when necessary to achieve something worthwhile. This kind of internal strength was much more impressive and valuable than the ability to push other people around or force them to do things against their will. It required genuine courage, intelligence, and character rather than just physical strength or social position. It also produced lasting results rather than temporary victories that had to be constantly defended through continued aggression. True power was also creative rather than merely destructive. Powerful individuals did not just tear down what others had built, but created something new and valuable themselves. They might be artists who produced beautiful works, scientists who made important discoveries, entrepreneurs who built successful businesses, or leaders who inspired others to achieve great things. They added value to the world, rather than simply taking value from others. They left the world richer and more interesting than they found it through their presence and efforts. This creative aspect of power was what Nietzsche most admired and what he hoped to encourage in others. It represented the highest expression of human potential and the best use of individual energy and talent. People who possessed this kind of power were sources of inspiration and growth rather than sources of fear and resentment. In contrast to genuine power, force was crude, reactive, and ultimately self-defeating. People who relied primarily on force were usually responding to their own feelings of weakness, inadequacy, or fear. They tried to make themselves feel better by making others feel worse. They sought to control external circumstances because they could not control their own internal states. They used aggression and intimidation to compensate for their lack of genuine strength and capability. This approach might work in the short term, but inevitably created resistance, resentment, and counterattacks that made their position less secure over time. Force was also wasteful and inefficient because it required constant vigilance and effort to maintain. People who ruled through force had to keep fighting to preserve their dominance rather than being able to focus their energy on creative and productive activities. Nietzsche was particularly critical of what he saw as the resentful use of moral language to disguise weakness as strength. Many people who could not achieve excellence through their own efforts tried to bring others down to their level through criticism, shaming, and moral condemnation. They created value systems that made virtues out of weakness and failures while treating strength and success as vices. They convinced themselves and others that their limitations were actually signs of moral superiority. This was what Nietzsche called slave morality, and he saw it as a particularly insidious form of false power. It allowed weak people to feel good about themselves without actually becoming stronger or more capable. It also prevented them from developing their potential because they had convinced themselves that improvement was unnecessary or even wrong. This kind of moral manipulation was more harmful than honest force because it corrupted people's thinking as well as their behavior. The confusion between power and force also extended to political and social arrangements. Many societies were organized around the principle that those who could use violence most effectively should be the ones who made decisions and controlled resources. This led to systems where the worst people often rose to positions of authority, while the best people were ignored or suppressed. Genuine leadership required wisdom, integrity, and the ability to inspire others to voluntary cooperation. But these qualities were often less effective than ruthlessness and brutality in the short-term competition for political power. The result was institutions that served the interests of the powerful rather than promoting human flourishing and excellence. Nietzsche hoped that eventually people would learn to distinguish between true leadership and mere domination and choose their authorities more wisely. This would require developing better standards for evaluating human worth and achievement. Individual development also required learning to recognize and cultivate genuine power while avoiding the temptations of false power. This meant focusing on building capabilities, skills, and character rather than just trying to accumulate wealth, status, or control over others. It meant taking responsibility for one's own life and choices rather than blaming external circumstances or other people for problems and failures. It meant setting high standards and working persistently to meet them rather than lowering standards to make success easier. It meant competing with oneself rather than primarily trying to defeat or surpass others. It meant being generous and helpful when possible, rather than hoarding resources or opportunities out of fear and insecurity. All of these practices required real strength and produced lasting benefits for both individuals and society. They represented what Nietzsche meant by the will to power when properly understood and applied. The ultimate expression of genuine power was what Nietzsche called self-overcoming, or the ability to continuously grow and improve throughout one's life. This involved regularly challenging oneself with new goals and difficulties rather than settling into comfortable routines. It meant being willing to question and revise one's beliefs and practices when better alternatives became available. It meant developing new skills and exploring new possibilities rather than just relying on past achievements. It meant facing one's limitations and weaknesses honestly and working systematically to address them. This process of self-development was never finished because there was always room for further growth and improvement. People who embraced this path became stronger and more capable over time rather than gradually declining and stagnating. They represented human potential at its best and served as examples of what was possible for anyone who had the courage and commitment to pursue excellence in their own lives. Part 17, The Genealogy of Morals. In one of his most systematic and influential works, On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche undertook a revolutionary investigation into the historical origins and development of moral concepts. Rather than simply accepting current ideas about good and evil as eternal truths, he asked how these concepts had emerged and evolved over time. His method was similar to that of a detective investigating a crime, or an archaeologist uncovering ancient artifacts. He looked for clues about the original meanings and purposes of moral ideas and traced how they had been modified by different groups and circumstances. What he discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of morality and revealed how current value systems had been shaped by historical forces that most people were unaware of. This genealogical approach opened up new possibilities for understanding and evaluating moral beliefs rather than simply taking them for granted. It also suggested that if moral concepts had been created by humans in the past, they could be modified or replaced by humans in the future when circumstances made such changes necessary or beneficial. This was one of Nietzsche's most important contributions to moral philosophy and continues to influence ethical thinking today. The genealogical method was based on the insight that moral concepts do not exist in isolation, but are embedded in larger systems of belief and practice. To understand why people value particular things or consider certain actions right or wrong, we need to understand the social, economic, and psychological contexts in which those values developed. Moral ideas that seem obvious and natural to us might actually be the products of specific historical circumstances that no longer exist. They might have served important functions in the past, but become obsolete or even harmful in changed conditions. Or they might have been created to serve the interests of particular groups rather than promoting general human welfare. By uncovering these hidden histories, the genealogical approach could help people make more informed decisions about which values to preserve and which to modify or abandon. It could also help them understand why different cultures and historical periods had developed such different ideas about right and wrong. This understanding could promote greater tolerance and humility, while also enabling more thoughtful criticism of both traditional and contemporary moral systems. Nietzsche's most famous genealogical analysis concerned the development of what he called good and evil morality from what had originally been good and bad morality. In ancient aristocratic societies, good originally meant noble, excellent, powerful, beautiful, and life-affirming. Bad meant common, mediocre, weak, ugly, and life-denying. These evaluations were made from the perspective of the ruling classes who had the power to impose their values on society. They celebrated their own qualities and achievements while looking down on those who lacked their advantages. This was what Nietzsche called master morality, and it was primarily concerned with promoting excellence and hierarchy rather than equality and compassion. The masters did not feel guilty about their privileges or apologetic about their success. They saw themselves as naturally superior and believed that this superiority gave them the right and duty to lead and command others. But over time, this aristocratic value system was challenged and eventually overthrown by what Nietzsche called the slave revolt in morality. The oppressed and disadvantaged classes developed their own moral system that inverted the values of their masters. What the masters called good, the slaves called evil. Strength, pride, and worldly success became sins rather than virtues. What the masters called bad, the slaves called good. Weakness, humility, and suffering became signs of moral superiority rather than inferiority. This slave morality was not created through rational reflection about what would promote human flourishing, but through psychological resentment against those who possessed what the slaves lacked. Unable to achieve excellence themselves, they convinced themselves that excellence was actually a form of corruption. Unable to overcome their circumstances through strength and skill, they made virtues out of their limitations and turned their resentment into a moral system. This allowed them to feel superior to their masters, despite being inferior in terms of actual capabilities and achievements. Christianity represented the ultimate triumph of slave morality in Western civilization. Jesus himself embodied many of the values that slaves had developed in opposition to their masters. He chose poverty over wealth, weakness over power, and suffering over pleasure. He blessed the meek, the poor in spirit, and those who mourned, while warning about the spiritual dangers of worldly success. His followers were indeed primarily slaves and outcasts from Roman society, who found comfort in a religion that promised to reverse all existing hierarchies. The last would be first, the humble would be exalted, and the powerful would be brought low. Over several centuries, this slave morality gradually conquered the master morality of the classical world. The values of strength, beauty, and excellence that had characterized Greek and Roman culture were replaced by values of humility, self-denial, and otherworldliness. This great transformation had profound effects on art, politics, philosophy, and every other aspect of European life. It created a civilization that was more egalitarian and compassionate than what had come before, but also more mediocre and life-denying. Nietzsche's genealogical analysis also revealed how moral concepts like guilt, sin, and bad conscience had developed from more primitive ideas about debt and punishment. In early human societies, wrongdoing was primarily understood in terms of harm done to specific individuals or groups. The appropriate response was compensation or retaliation that would restore balance and deter future offences. But gradually, these concrete relationships were abstracted into metaphysical concepts about universal justice and divine judgment. People began to feel guilty not just about specific harms they had caused, but about their very existence as flawed and sinful creatures. They developed what Nietzsche called bad conscience, a tendency to turn their aggressive instincts inward against themselves rather than directing them toward external goals. This internalization of aggression created tremendous psychological suffering, but also made possible the development of conscience, self-reflection, and moral responsibility. It was both a sickness and a necessary stage in the evolution of human consciousness. The genealogical method also illuminated how supposedly objective moral principles were actually expressions of particular psychological types and their needs. People who valued equality and compassion were often those who would benefit from more egalitarian social arrangements. People who valued hierarchy and excellence were often those who had achieved success within existing competitive systems. People who emphasized duty and obedience were often those who had been trained to follow authority rather than think for themselves. People who stressed individual freedom and responsibility were often those who had the strength and capability to handle such freedom effectively. None of these value systems were necessarily wrong, but they were all partial and reflected the interests and perspectives of their advocates. Understanding these psychological motivations could help people evaluate moral arguments more critically and develop more sophisticated approaches to ethical questions. It could also help them recognize their own biases and limitations when making moral judgments. By revealing the human origins of moral concepts, the genealogical approach opened up new possibilities for moral creativity and innovation. If values had been created by humans in the past, then they could be modified or replaced by humans in the future when circumstances made such changes beneficial. This did not mean that anything goes or that all moral systems are equally valid. But it did mean that people could take active responsibility for creating values that served life and growth, rather than simply following inherited traditions. They could evaluate different moral possibilities based on their practical consequences, rather than their supposed correspondence to eternal truths. They could also develop more nuanced and contextual approaches to ethics that took into account the complexity and diversity of human experience. The genealogy of morals was therefore not just an academic exercise, but a practical tool for creating better ways of living and organizing human societies. It represented Nietzsche's attempt to clear the ground for the construction of new and healthier value systems that could guide humanity into an uncertain but potentially promising future. Part 18. Self-Overcoming. Central to Nietzsche's vision of human potential was the concept of self-overcoming, which he expressed in German as Selbstüberwindung. This idea represented his understanding of what made human existence most meaningful and what distinguished the highest types of people from the mediocre masses. Self-overcoming involved the continuous process of growing beyond one's current limitations and becoming more than one previously was. It meant constantly challenging oneself with new goals, developing new capabilities, and exploring new possibilities rather than settling into comfortable routines and accepting one's present state as permanent. For Nietzsche, this drive towards self-improvement and self-transcendence was not just one possible path among many, but the fundamental purpose that gave human life its distinctive value and meaning. People who embraced self-overcoming were participating in the ongoing evolution of consciousness and contributing to the advancement of the human species. Those who avoided this challenge were essentially choosing stagnation over growth and mediocrity over excellence. Understanding and practicing self-overcoming was therefore essential for anyone who wanted to live up to their full potential as human beings. The process of self-overcoming typically began with honest self-assessment and recognition of one's current limitations. Most people preferred to avoid looking too closely at their weaknesses, failures, and areas where they fell short of their own ideals. They made excuses, blamed external circumstances, or simply ignored problems rather than confronting them directly. But self-overcoming required the courage to see oneself clearly and acknowledge uncomfortable truths about one's character, capabilities, and achievements. This was not about self-hatred or destructive self-criticism, but about realistic evaluation that could serve as the foundation for improvement. People needed to understand where they currently stood before they could plan effective strategies for moving forward. They needed to identify their genuine strengths as well as their limitations so they could build on what was working while addressing what was not. This kind of honest self-knowledge was painful but liberating because it freed people from illusions that prevented them from making real progress. Self-overcoming also required setting ambitious but achievable goals that would stretch one's capabilities without being impossible to reach. The goals needed to be specific enough to provide clear direction and measurable enough to track progress. They needed to be personally meaningful rather than just socially approved or externally imposed. They needed to require genuine effort and growth rather than just the application of existing skills and knowledge. Finding the right balance was crucial because goals that were too easy would not promote development, while goals that were too difficult would lead to frustration and discouragement. The process of setting and pursuing such goals helped people discover their own interests, values, and priorities, rather than simply following what others expected of them. It also helped them develop the discipline, persistence, and resilience that were necessary for achieving anything worthwhile in life. Each successfully completed goal became the foundation for setting and pursuing even more ambitious objectives. One of the key aspects of self-overcoming was learning to embrace difficulty and resistance rather than avoiding them. Most people naturally sought the path of least resistance and tried to minimize effort, discomfort, and uncertainty in their lives. But Nietzsche argued that this tendency was ultimately self-defeating, because growth only occurred when people pushed against their current limitations. Muscles became stronger through resistance training that challenged them beyond their current capacity. Mental abilities improved through tackling problems that required new ways of thinking and learning. Character developed through facing moral challenges that required courage, integrity, and self-discipline. People who always chose the easy path remained weak and underdeveloped, while those who voluntarily accepted difficult challenges became stronger and more capable over time. This did not mean seeking out unnecessary suffering or making life harder than it needed to be. It meant recognizing that some degree of struggle and effort was the price of growth and being willing to pay that price in pursuit of excellence. It also meant learning to find satisfaction and even joy in the process of overcoming obstacles rather than just in reaching final destinations. Self-overcoming was not just about improving specific skills or achieving particular accomplishments, but about transforming one's entire approach to existence. It involved developing what Nietzsche called a philosophy of experimentation and growth that could guide decision-making and priority setting. This meant treating one's own life as a kind of artistic project that was constantly being refined and improved. It meant being willing to question and revise one's beliefs, habits and goals when better alternatives became available. It meant taking calculated risks and trying new approaches rather than always sticking with proven methods. It meant learning from both successes and failures rather than being paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. People who adopted this experimental attitude became more creative, adaptable, and resilient than those who clung to rigid plans and expectations. They also became more interesting to themselves and others because they were constantly developing new perspectives and capabilities. The practice of self-overcoming also had important social and cultural dimensions. People who were actively working to improve themselves often inspired others to do the same through their example and encouragement. They created environments where growth and excellence were valued and supported rather than feared or resented. They contributed to their communities not just through their achievements but through their commitment to raising standards and expanding possibilities. They refused to accept mediocrity as inevitable and demonstrated that significant improvement was possible for anyone willing to make the necessary effort. This had positive effects that extended far beyond their individual lives and helped create cultures that promoted human flourishing rather than just survival and comfort. In contrast, people who avoided self-overcoming often became sources of negativity and limitation for those around them. They discouraged others from pursuing ambitious goals and tried to bring everyone down to their own level of mediocrity. Nietzsche believed that self-overcoming was not just beneficial for individuals and societies, but was actually essential for the continued evolution of human consciousness. Just as biological evolution had produced increasingly complex and capable organisms over millions of years, cultural evolution could produce increasingly sophisticated and powerful forms of human awareness and ability. But this process was not automatic and required the conscious participation of individuals who were willing to push beyond their current limitations. People who embraced self-overcoming were participating in this larger evolutionary process and helping to create new possibilities for future generations. They were ancestors of the Übermensch, who would eventually emerge when enough people had developed the courage and capability to transcend their present condition. This gave their individual efforts a cosmic significance that extended far beyond their personal benefit. They were not just improving their own lives, but contributing to the advancement of life itself. This understanding could provide tremendous motivation and meaning for anyone who was committed to the difficult but rewarding path of continuous growth and self-improvement. Part 19. The Antichrist. In one of his most controversial and misunderstood works, The Antichrist, Nietzsche launched his most direct attack on Christianity and its influence on Western civilization. This book was not written from the perspective of atheistic hostility or simple rebellion against religious authority. Instead, it represented Nietzsche's attempt to diagnose what he saw as a cultural sickness that was preventing Europeans from achieving their full potential as human beings. He argued that Christian values and assumptions had become so deeply embedded in European thought that even secular people were unconsciously shaped by them. These influences were making people weak, passive, and unable to affirm life with the kind of joy and strength that had characterized healthier civilizations. Understanding Nietzsche's critique of Christianity is therefore essential for grasping his overall philosophy and his vision of what humanity could become if it freed itself from life-denying influences. It also helps explain why he believed that a fundamental revaluation of all values was necessary for the renewal of European culture. His goal was not simply to destroy, but to clear the ground for something better and more life-affirming to emerge. Nietzsche's criticism of Christianity focused primarily on what he saw as its systematic devaluation of this world in favor of an imaginary afterlife. Christian teaching encouraged people to see earthly existence as a temporary trial or punishment that had to be endured rather than as something valuable in itself. The real goal of life was not to flourish and excel in this world, but to earn salvation and eternal reward in the next. This otherworldly orientation had devastating effects on human psychology and culture, because it prevented people from fully engaging with their actual circumstances and possibilities. Instead of working to improve their lives and societies, they focused on preparing for death and judgment. Instead of celebrating human achievements and capabilities, they emphasized human sinfulness and dependence on divine grace. Instead of pursuing excellence and beauty, they practiced humility and self-denial. The result was a civilization that was spiritually oriented, but also spiritually impoverished, because it had turned away from the sources of meaning and value that were actually available to human experience. Christianity also promoted what Nietzsche called a slave mentality that made virtues out of weakness and suffering. Jesus himself had embodied this inversion of values by choosing poverty over wealth, meekness over strength, and suffering over power. His followers were taught to turn the other cheek when attacked, to love their enemies, and to give away their possessions to the poor. These teachings might have been appropriate for oppressed people who had no other way to maintain their dignity and hope. But when they became the foundation for an entire civilization, they created a culture that was systematically opposed to excellence, achievement, and the full development of human potential. People learned to feel guilty about their successes and to pity rather than admire those who achieved greatness. They developed what Nietzsche called bad conscience, a tendency to turn their aggressive and creative energies inward against themselves rather than directing them towards external goals. This internalized self-attack made them psychologically sick and unable to pursue their own interests and values with confidence and enthusiasm. The Christian emphasis on equality and universal love also had harmful effects on social and cultural development. While these ideals might seem admirable in themselves, Nietzsche argued that they prevented the recognition and cultivation of genuine differences in human capability and achievement. If everyone was equally valuable in God's eyes, then there was no point in striving for excellence or trying to surpass others. If the goal was to love everyone equally, then special relationships and loyalties became suspect as forms of selfishness or prejudice. If the highest virtue was compassion for the suffering, then strength and health became less important than weakness and sickness. These attitudes created a leveling effect that pulled everyone down toward the lowest common denominator rather than inspiring people to reach for their highest possibilities. They also made it difficult to create the kinds of hierarchical institutions that were necessary for preserving and transmitting cultural achievements across generations. Instead of celebrating human greatness, Christian culture systematically undermined the conditions that made greatness possible. Nietzsche was particularly critical of what he saw as Christianity's dishonest approach to truth and knowledge. Christian doctrine claimed to be based on divine revelation that provided absolute and eternal answers to fundamental questions about existence. But these claims could not be verified through reason or experience, and required believers to accept them on faith rather than evidence. This created a habit of believing things because they were comforting or socially acceptable rather than because they were true. It also made people suspicious of intellectual inquiry that might challenge religious beliefs. Scientific investigation, philosophical reflection, and artistic exploration were all potentially dangerous because they might lead to conclusions that conflicted with official doctrine. The result was a culture that paid lip service to truth while actually being organized around the maintenance of useful illusions. People learned to say one thing while thinking another, and to suppress doubts and questions that might disturb their peace of mind. This intellectual dishonesty corrupted not just religious thinking, but all other forms of cultural activity as well. It made genuine creativity and innovation much more difficult because people were afraid to explore ideas that might be considered heretical or dangerous. Despite these harsh criticisms, Nietzsche did not completely dismiss the historical importance of Christianity or deny that it had made some positive contributions to human development. He recognized that Christian values had helped to civilize barbaric peoples and create more humane societies during the chaotic centuries following the fall of Rome. The emphasis on compassion, forgiveness, and care for the weak had reduced violence and cruelty in many contexts. The development of institutions like hospitals, schools, and charitable organizations had improved the lives of countless people. The Christian focus on inner life and moral reflection had contributed to the development of psychology and ethics, but Nietzsche argued that these beneficial effects had been purchased at too high a price, and that Christianity had outlived its historical usefulness. By the 19th century, it had become more of an obstacle than an aid to further human development. Its otherworldly orientation was preventing people from addressing the real challenges and opportunities of modern life. Its egalitarian ideology was making it difficult to recognize and cultivate human excellence. Its reliance on faith rather than reason was undermining the intellectual honesty that was necessary for scientific and cultural progress. Nietzsche's critique of Christianity was ultimately part of his larger project of creating space for new and healthier forms of spirituality and meaning. He did not want to eliminate the human need for transcendence and purpose, but to redirect it toward this world rather than an imaginary afterlife. He wanted to replace Christian virtues with classical virtues that promoted strength, beauty, and excellence rather than weakness, ugliness, and mediocrity. He wanted to substitute creative self-affirmation for self-denying obedience to external authority. He wanted to encourage intellectual honesty and courage rather than faith and submission. Most importantly, he wanted to help people learn to find meaning and value in their actual lives and circumstances rather than in fantasies about future rewards and punishments. This transformation would not be easy and would require exceptional individuals who could create new values and inspire others to follow their example. But Nietzsche believed it was both possible and necessary for the continued health and development of human civilization. The Antichrist was therefore not just a destroyer, but a liberator who cleared the way for something better to emerge. He represented the possibility of moving beyond Christianity toward forms of spirituality that were more honest, more life-affirming, and more conducive to human flourishing and excellence. Part 20. What does not kill me makes me stronger. Perhaps no quote from Nietzsche has become more famous or more widely misunderstood than his declaration that what does not kill me makes me stronger. This phrase has been repeated countless times in popular culture, self-help books and motivational speeches as a simple formula for overcoming adversity. But like many of Nietzsche's most memorable statements, its actual meaning is much more complex and nuanced than its popular usage suggests. Understanding what he really meant requires examining the psychological and philosophical context in which he developed this idea. It also requires recognizing that he was not offering a universal law about human psychology, but describing a particular attitude and approach to suffering that could be cultivated by certain types of people under certain conditions. When properly understood, this teaching reveals important insights about human resilience, growth, and the transformation of pain into wisdom and strength. But when misapplied, it can lead to harmful attitudes that ignore the real damage that trauma and suffering can cause to human beings. Exploring the full meaning of this famous phrase, therefore, provides an excellent window into both the power and the limitations of Nietzsche's approach to human psychology and development. The original context for this statement appears in Twilight of the Idols, where Nietzsche was describing his own psychological constitution and the way he had learned to respond to the difficulties and setbacks in his life. He was not making a claim about how suffering affects all people, but explaining how he personally had managed to grow stronger through experiencing and overcoming various forms of adversity. This distinction is crucial because Nietzsche was well aware that many people were indeed killed or permanently damaged by their sufferings. He had witnessed the effects of war, poverty, illness, and other forms of trauma on his contemporaries, and understood that not everyone had the psychological resources to transform negative experiences into positive growth. What he was describing was a particular capacity that some individuals possessed, and that others might be able to develop through practice and education. It was an ideal to strive toward rather than an automatic response that could be taken for granted. He was also describing a process that required conscious effort and intention rather than something that happened passively or naturally. People had to actively work to extract strength and wisdom from their sufferings rather than simply enduring them and hoping for the best. The transformation of suffering into strength involved several psychological processes that Nietzsche had observed in himself and other resilient individuals. First was the ability to maintain perspective and see difficulties as temporary challenges rather than permanent disasters. People who could grow stronger through adversity understood that most problems were solvable and that most pain was temporary if they could endure it long enough. They did not catastrophize or assume that current difficulties would last forever, or that they were powerless to improve their situation. Second was the capacity to learn from negative experiences and extract useful lessons that could guide future behavior. Instead of simply feeling sorry for themselves or blaming others for their problems, they asked what they could do differently next time to avoid similar difficulties. They treated setbacks as educational opportunities that provided valuable information about themselves and their environment. Third was the ability to use suffering as motivation for self-improvement and goal achievement rather than as an excuse for giving up or lowering their standards. They channeled their pain into productive activity rather than destructive behavior. Fourth was the development of empathy and compassion for others who were experiencing similar difficulties. Their own suffering helped them understand and connect with other people's pain in ways that made them more effective helpers and leaders. All of these processes required emotional maturity, intellectual honesty, and considerable mental strength. Nietzsche also recognized that the strengthening effects of adversity were not automatic, but depended on how people interpreted and responded to their experiences. The same objective situation could make one person stronger and another person weaker depending on their attitude and approach. People who maintained agency and responsibility for their responses tended to grow through difficulty, while those who saw themselves as helpless victims tended to be diminished by it. People who focused on what they could control and influence tended to emerge stronger, while those who focused on what they could not control tended to become bitter and resentful. People who maintained hope and worked toward future goals tended to benefit from their struggles, while those who gave up and became passive tended to be damaged by them. People who sought support from others and maintained social connections tended to recover better than those who isolated themselves and tried to handle everything alone. The key insight was that strength came not from the suffering itself, but from how people chose to relate to and work with their suffering. This meant that the development of resilience was partly a matter of learning better coping strategies and psychological skills, rather than just a matter of natural constitution or good fortune. The process of becoming stronger through adversity also required what Nietzsche called Amor Fati, or love of fate. This involved not just accepting what had happened, but actually embracing it as necessary for one's development and growth. People who could achieve this attitude were able to feel grateful even for their painful experiences, because they recognized how those experiences had contributed to making them who they were. They understood that editing out the difficult parts of their lives would also eliminate the wisdom, compassion, and strength they had gained from facing those difficulties. This was very different from passive resignation or bitter acceptance of unavoidable circumstances. It was an active affirmation of one's entire life story, including the chapters that had been painful to live through. This attitude freed people from resentment and regret that could poison their present happiness and prevented them from learning from their past experiences. It also gave them the psychological foundation they needed to face future challenges with confidence and equanimity. However, Nietzsche's teaching about growing stronger through adversity should not be misunderstood as an endorsement of unnecessary suffering, or a denial of the real damage that trauma can cause. He was not suggesting that people should seek out painful experiences, or that all forms of suffering were beneficial. Some types of trauma could indeed permanently damage people's capacity for trust, intimacy, and psychological health. Some experiences were so overwhelming that they exceeded people's ability to process and integrate them constructively. Some individuals lacked the psychological resources or social support necessary to transform negative experiences into positive growth. Nietzsche's insight was that certain types of people under certain types of conditions could learn to become stronger through facing and overcoming difficulties. But this was not a universal law that applied to everyone in all circumstances. It was more like a skill that could be developed by those who had the capacity and opportunity to do so. The practical application of this teaching, therefore, required considerable wisdom and discrimination. People needed to learn the difference between challenges that could promote growth and trauma that could cause permanent damage. They needed to develop the psychological skills and social support systems that would enable them to handle adversity constructively. They needed to understand their own limitations and seek help when difficulties exceeded their current capacity to cope. They needed to distinguish between suffering that served a purpose and suffering that was simply destructive. Most importantly, they needed to remember that becoming stronger through adversity was an achievement that required effort and intention rather than something that happened automatically. When properly understood and applied, Nietzsche's insight could indeed help people develop greater resilience and extract meaning from their difficulties. But when misunderstood or misapplied, it could lead to harmful attitudes that ignored the reality of trauma and the importance of getting appropriate help when facing overwhelming challenges. The goal was not to seek out suffering, but to develop the capacity to grow through whatever difficulties life inevitably brought. This was both a psychological skill and a philosophical attitude that could serve people well throughout their lives if they learned to cultivate it wisely and responsibly.